Good afternoon and welcome. Distinguished panelists and guests, my name is Diana Castañeda, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the 22nd Annual CAF Conference, co-hosted by CAF, Development Bank of Latin America, Inter-American Dialogue, and the Organization of American States. As a longtime journalist, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome you to this dynamic and inspiring venue, the Annenberg Theater at the Museum, dedicated to increasing public understanding of the importance to their lives of a free press and the freedoms guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution's First Amendment. Before proceeding with introductions, allow me to suggest following the conference on Twitter by using hashtag Diálogo CAF 2018, and please tell your friends and colleagues who couldn't not make it today to tune into the live web streaming, either on the Inter-American Dialogue's website for English or on CAF's website for Spanish. Finally, before we begin our 2 days of what promises to be engaging and lively discussions, I would like to introduce the Honorable Luis Carranza, President of CAF, Development Bank of Latin America, the Honorable Luis Almagro, Secretary General of the Organization of American States, and Mr. Michael Shifter, President of the Inter-American Dialogue, who will each offer welcoming remarks to open the conference.
Muy buenas tardes.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure for me to welcome you to our annual conference. I would like to offer a few brief words before giving the floor to Luis Almagro. I'd like to start by thanking the Organization of American States and the Inter-American Dialogue for organizing this venue for debate about topics that are important for Latin America. Personally, I can say that Luis and Michael have been great collaborators in this endeavor. Latin America is at a crossroads right now, and this conference is going to focus on 4 key aspects. The first has to do with the need for fiscal consolidation in a number of countries in the region that are making efforts to rein in the fiscal deficit such that their public debt can be put on a sustainable trajectory over time. Now, the efforts put forward by the different countries have not all been the same, but eventually we're going to have to achieve fiscal consolidation in the region. The other issue under debate is the relationship with China, which has grown over time and will continue to grow. How can we, as a region, avail ourselves of that growth is key to the long-term growth of Latin America. The third issue relates to institutional challenges, not just from the standpoint of how we can have more efficient states in the provision of services of the quality necessary, but how to enhance transparency to avoid corruption. Freedom of expression plays a central role in this issue. And then we have the issue of low productivity in the region. This challenge, which means that we not only need to understand what needs to be done, but how to do it. And it also entails our arriving at key political consensuses to enhance investments and productivity. These are the challenges that we pose at this conference. We thank you all for being here. I'm certain that we will draw some very important conclusions and lessons from this debate. Welcome. It's a pleasure for me to be here with you today and to have this opportunity to visit with you in this imposing building, a place that celebrates journalism and the freedom of thought, the freedom to write, to speak directly from one's mind, the freedom of expression, to express facts and realities. These values can't always be taken for granted in our hemisphere. Human rights are violated not only by the excluding vision and some of the structural problems in our region, that is poverty, inequality, but also rights that relate to fundamental rights, which in many cases are violated by those in power, those who should be on the side of upholding and preserving people's rights. This year, hundreds of people have been murdered for protesting against governments. This year, we've seen the largest massive exodus in the history of our continent. 2,200,000 people have abandoned the criminal dictatorship of Maduro and have sought better horizons to meet the most basic needs that people have, that is, food and medicine. Also, seeking rights that they can enjoy and exercise freely in our continent or outside of our continent. Despite that, regime stays in place, and despite the humanitarian crisis, it alleges that this crisis is an invention by those that Maduro declares as his enemies in the hemisphere. And the number of journalists killed in some of our states surpasses even those who have died in war zones. Now, this CAF conference, between last year's and this conference, we have two presidents, rather, have been imprisoned for acts of corruption. We have the super cycle of commodity prices, and this has affected the operation of our economies. We've also had to deal with cases of corruption that have engulfed the whole region. I'm talking about Odebrecht and PVDS. Now, we need to draw lessons from this. What lessons should we draw from this in our continent? Development of our democracy, where we stand in our democracies, the principles of human rights and democracy should always come first. Even those economies growing the fastest in our region, in which direct foreign investment is flowing in, still don't achieve the levels of development desired, nor are rights and freedoms always upheld, and the benefits don't always redound to those most in need. Now, this annual conference is the time for us to take a look at these central issues and pending challenges, changes that are afoot, and we find ourselves at a juncture in which we need to wage this struggle to tackle these challenges that we always discuss at events such as this. The lasting exclusion of people in the economic modernization process. Our region is still the most unequal in the world, but we should also find the way to tackle new challenges. The challenge of that entails our leaders' commitment vis-a-vis human principles and values that, without a doubt, are timeless. As far as their needing to be defended, championed, upheld, the rule of leadership to serve people and to defend their rights. We can't see how such principles are sidelined or that political structures simply become power plays, oftentimes imbued with corruption. We can't allow that the political leadership in the continent allow for impunity to prevail. The truth is, our jobs are temporary, they are provisional, and we are simply respecting an electoral mandate in holding these elective positions. Nicolás Maduro, as a case in point, lives in a parallel universe, one of drug trafficking, of organized crime, which have taken his illegitimate government to be responsible for the largest destruction of a society that's in a free fall right now, the bankruptcy of a country rich in petroleum, such as Venezuela, seems to be a difficult concept to grasp, even when dealing with Maduro, because his regime, what it has done since 2013 on, this is a dictatorship in our region that continues to torture those who speak out against him. His dictatorship has stood as an example for a textbook examples of how to destroy an economy in modern times, how to demoralize its people, how to install hate as a standard of behavior, how to drive people to hunger, starvation, and to at the same time allege that everything is hunky-dory. So this massive exodus of Venezuelans throughout the region, as if this were fake news, something that the empire alleges, and that is cowardice. The hemisphere needs democracy as its definitive target and as an ongoing process that it strives for. We should walk down this path of democracy. If we're going to fight against dictatorships, if we want a continent free from dictatorships, we have to do everything we can to do away with the impunity of those who have committed acts against humanity or human rights violations. This is part and parcel of our work. We need to combat corruption. We need to hold ourselves to the highest public scrutiny, internationally or nationally. We cannot allow ourselves to become, to eviscerate our principles and purposes and do away with the principles that should guide our work, for which we have been elected. We aren't doing this for ourselves. We're not doing this to play a leading role, to showboat in the organization that we represent or where we work. We do this rather. We should do this for the people of our continent, those who find themselves in the worst situation, who are starving, who are compelled to leave their countries, who are being tortured and repressed, who have been intimidated, and who have been left bereft in extreme poverty, all of whom are being discriminated against. When I speak of leadership, I'm not only referring to politicians or leaders of international organizations, but rather everyone, all of us. Those here today, we need to become a team fighting for democracy and human rights, to uphold and champion principles, to set aside our petty political concerns. This should be an annual exercise. No, this needs to be an ongoing exercise. Everywhere we work and everything we do, the defense of democracy is permanent, and it depends on falls to each citizen. Now, democracy cannot self-correct. We need to correct it. If we want better democracies, freer societies, more rights for more people. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I am very happy to welcome all of you to the 22nd Annual Conference, widely known as the CAF Conference, organized by CAF, the Development Bank of Latin America, the Inter-American Dialogue, and the Organization of American States. I'm really grateful to you for joining us for this conference. I want to extend special thanks to President Luis Carranza of CAF and Secretary General Luis Almagro for the confianza, support, and collaboration in this joint effort. I want to recognize the leadership of two multilateral organizations that play such a crucial role in our hemisphere today. I also want to recognize Carla Hills, the Dialogue's co-chair and former U.S. trade representative who joins us today. This conference has seen dramatic changes and growth over the last 2 decades. It began as a meeting in 1996 that brought together 30 or 35 participants in the Dialogue's old office to discuss trade and investment in the Andean region. Today's conference features a wide variety of themes, and we meet in this magnificent and very meaningful venue. For the Dialogue, the annual gathering is crucial. It gives our organization an opportunity to bring together and engage diverse leaders of differing perspectives and generations, not only from this hemisphere, but globally. The idea is to review recent developments in the Americas and think of ways to best advance our goals of democratic governance, social equity, and prosperity. The agenda features topics that cannot be left out of a conference like this, including taking stock of the region's economic and political situation and outlook. But we also strive to anticipate and focus on emergent issues that may well become more salient in coming years. And we do our best to call attention to particular countries that too often get overlooked or are overshadowed by groups working on Latin America and the Caribbean. All of you already know that these are highly challenging and uncertain times throughout the Americas and indeed throughout the world. We are also witnessing phenomena that most of us didn't expect to see. This is a moment to go back to first principles. And there is no principle more fundamental for the defense of democracy and rule of law than freedom of the press, the topic of our first session this afternoon. We're delighted to have first-rate editors, journalists, and legal experts throughout the Americas, including the United States. This is the first time this topic has been on our agenda. It has been a major emphasis of the Dialogue's work for years, and even more so today. Our second and last session this afternoon looks at China-Latin American relations, a topic that was emphasized by President Carranza. No conference that aims to understand the economic future of the region can leave out China's deepening engagement. This is one of the core priority programs of the Dialogue and has expanded over the past decade. We're delighted to have both leading analysts and practitioners in this area. Tomorrow morning, we'll start with one of our standard panels. High-level officials, multilateral institutions will offer an assessment of the region's economic situation and outlook. That will be followed by a discussion of how Latin America can use innovation to close the productivity gap. Many of our countries are seeing high levels of polarization that make reaching consensus very difficult. Our first panel tomorrow in the afternoon features young leaders from the region in key local and national government positions, as well as new political parties, to share their thoughts about how to deal with and overcome the short-term thinking that afflicts many of our countries. And in the final panel of first-rate professors and analysts, we will explore the implications of recent elections and the most notable political trends, looking at 5 Latin American countries: Colombia, Mexico, Brazil, Paraguay, and Venezuela. We'll hear perspectives about what we can expect from the new administrations in Colombia, Mexico, Paraguay, the first round of elections just a month from now in Brazil, and of course, how to bring to an end the deepening crisis in Venezuela. So I think we have a terrifically exciting and full agenda over the next day and a half, and I very much hope all of you can stay with us. A final word. I want to thank CAF's excellent staff, Victorico Giampiero Leoncini and Patricio Skeff, for the close collaboration with the Dialogue's own stellar and amazing team, led by Missy Reef, a real taskmaster, and Joan Caivano, who have been working tirelessly on this conference over a number of months. Thank you all, and please enjoy the conference.
Thank you, President Carranza, Secretary General Almagro, and Mr. Trifter for those inspiring words to launch our 2 days of conference deliberations. Ladies and gentlemen, please let us have your attention as the first session is about to begin. Our distinguished panelists will discuss 21st century challenges to a free press. It is now my pleasure to introduce the moderator for our first session, Catalina Botero, Dean of the Faculty of Law at Universidad de los Andes and founding partner of the nonprofit De Justicia Colombia. Catalina previously served as a special rapporteur for freedom of expression of the OAS Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. So please join me in welcoming to the stage Catalina Botero and the speakers for this panel.
Buenas tardes.
Good afternoon to all who are with us today, and thank you to CAF, the Dialogue, and the OAS for the invitation. The first panel is of particular significance for me because speaking about freedom of expression is to speak about democracy, and I think we need to speak about democracy these days. It is a pleasure for me to moderate and an honor as well to have as my guests 4 journalists. I will introduce them very quickly. They are very well known, but I will just allow them to speak. Marty Barron is editor of the Washington Post. He has won several Pulitzer Prizes, and he is a celebrity in journalism. So thank you very much for being here, Marty. Carlos Raimundo Roberts is editor and columnist of the most important newspaper in Argentina. He is the director of the La Nación and the master's program in Torquato di Tella University. He is very well recognized, and through his opinion column, which is also a humor column, he has extraordinarily portrayed the Cristina Fernandez, the Kirchner regime. Roberto Pombo has been director of several newspapers, and today he is editor of El Tiempo, which is the one with the highest circulation in Colombia. He has won several awards, and he has been a reporter, and now he is an editor going through the whole gamut. And Carlos Dada is the founder of the most important newspaper, a digital newspaper, El Faro. El Faro started doing research and investigation on the maras and organized crime in El Salvador. And today, Carlos Dada writes about what happens in Central America in general. He has received the Cabot Award and another award of excellence by the New Journalism Foundation. We are going to be speaking Spanish, but Marty will speak English. So those of you who are not bilingual are going to need to have your headsets for interpretation. But I am going to Mónica González is not with us today we had invited Monica Gonzalez. She's from Chile, and she is maybe one of the most well-known investigative reporters in Latin America. She had to cancel last minute, and we are very saddened that she is not here with us. Her voice is very significant, and so we will miss her. So the panel will be about the 21st century challenges to a free press in the Americas. So I'm going to make a short presentation. I will make a short presentation, then I'll ask a question for each one of you, and then I'll have a specific question for each of one, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience, and then the journalists will respond. Remember, it's not often that you have journalists answering questions instead of asking them. I was the former OAS Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression, and there are three problems in freedom of expression. First is authoritarianism. There is on the right, like the one we are living through in the United States, but other countries such as Colombia or Martinelli in Panama on the left, and clearly Hugo Chavez or Rafael Correa or Maduro or what is going on in Nicaragua, which is a true tragedy. So that's the first challenge, because authoritarianism needs to concentrate power, and the media then become the enemy to power concentration. So their target is independent media. They want to go against it, and this is a great threat. Authoritarianism has been supported, as you have seen, those who saw the meeting at the United Nations where Russia defended Nicaragua and China and China also defends authoritarian regimes. Authoritarianism is not an isolated problem. And also, we have drug trafficking, which includes not only drug trafficking, but also traffic of human beings and of gas, of whatever. It's a great multinational company. It operates as a multinational, and they have a great ability to destabilize, and they need to be clandestine. And independent media are the enemy of this clandestine status, because the press, the media, denounces all these types of illicit trade, and so they are also a target by the illicit trade groups. And also the business model. Doing journalism is expensive, and if you become an investigative reporter, then it is even more expensive. Yes, internet has democratized the media, but it has also generated the idea that we're all appropriately informed if we get our information from Twitter and Facebook. Facebook and Twitter and our followers, or those who we follow in those accounts in social media, do not do the same work as independent and professional media. So if that's our only source of information, then we are misinformed. But we don't know this. The market wants you to interact at those levels in social media, and they're going against professional and investigative reporters. And this is a grave problem for a democratic society. And these are the three challenges, the way I see it. And I will start in order. Marty, which are the challenges for the media?
I think they are very similar to the ones that you just mentioned. If I had to list three in the United States, I would say the greatest challenge is, first of all, that we continue to struggle with coming up with a sustainable economic model for the press, particularly the print press, the traditional print press, newspapers, and those pressures are going to continue. They will not diminish over time. The pressures from the internet are immense. Readers are going to different places. Advertisers are going to different places. places. And so I think the basic economic foundation for the press has been disrupted and disrupted permanently. Number two, currently in the United States, I would say the greatest challenge is the current administration, which has launched an attack on the press. This began during the 2 years in which Donald Trump was conducting a presidential campaign, and it has continued during the first year and a half in which he has been president. And so he has attacked the press continuously. His effort is to delegitimize, to marginalize, to demonize the press, and to disqualify the press as an independent arbiter of fact, a traditional role that it has had in a democracy. And his objective is not just to disqualify us as independent arbiters of fact, but to disqualify any independent arbiter of fact other than the White House and Donald Trump himself. So universities, courts, intelligence agencies, law enforcement agencies, scientists, all are essentially being disqualified as independent arbiters of fact. And then number three is, I think, just the spread of misinformation and disinformation and outright falsehoods and lies throughout the information ecosystem. The information ecosystem has become contaminated with false information, and I think it's very difficult now for the public to know what's true and what's false, and it leads to a level of cynicism, a belief that you can't possibly know what's true, and also a sense that I should only believe what affirms my pre-existing point of view. And so I would say that those are the three challenges that we face, and the greatest being the last one that I mentioned, is that people are unable to distinguish between what's true and false. And that is the environment in which we're operating now, and it's an incredibly difficult environment in which to operate.
Gracias, Martin. Roberto.
Bueno, aquí nos vamos a repetir.
Now, maybe we are going to be repeating ourselves, and I think the first challenge for the press is existence, or being able to survive in a place that is dramatically changing in two ways. In a way, as was said before, it is the economic model of traditional media has been threatened, highly threatened, and there is a bloody revolution. We see heads rolling from the guillotine of the technical changes, brought about by technological changes. People have changed, and advertising has changed the way in which they do advertising in traditional media, and then we need to keep on keeping on. We need to make sure that it is not our head rolling next, and so we need to adapt ourselves. We need to understand that what is going on is not a whim of the economy, but it is a natural evolution of human beings and the way in which they are consuming media, and this explosion of social media resulting from the advances in technology, it is more a democratic boon than a threat for the free press and freedom of expression in general. But there is another basic threat, and it is that traditional media and journalists who do serious journalism have to convince with our behavior and our attitudes the public. And you have mentioned the investigative units. We need to, again, convince the people that the place to be is the serious media, serious press. We have a challenge which is bigger now than it was before, to demonstrate that we are a traditional brand, that we are serious in our behavior. And we don't need to be historically there, but we can have new digital media, but working seriously. And we have to be self-critical. And sometimes I say this and other people don't like it. I believe that journalists need to be self-critical, and we need to be aware of the place we have now in society. Journalists were normal members of the community that went to the media, and in the media they went inside the community as someone else. Well, they had ability to orient and ability to critique and to make judgments, but journalists have become a caste that is questioning society, and we have established doubt and suspicion as the mechanism to have a relationship with the powers that be and society in general. And maybe the proliferation of electronic media are now putting us in our place, and they are beginning to doubt us. And even more so, do we need to be closer to the community than we have in the past? And there is another challenge, at least in Colombia, obviously, violence by groups related to drug trafficking, some insurgent groups, etc., even less and less insurgent groups, but they are exercising pressure on the community and journalists, and it is so huge that it makes it almost impossible in certain places to consider that the press is free, even though theoretically the governments will give journalists or the people the freedom to express themselves. And finally, the threat that obviously exists of political leaders and presidents who are at heart dictators, who are eliminating principles that were already people thought they had been won for society, but they have been gradually been lost. Venezuela and Nicaragua are two of the cases that have been added to the situation in Cuba. And these would be, for me, the three big challenges that the press has. Carlos. Thank you, Catalina. Good afternoon. Thank you, CAF and the Inter-American Dialogue for the invitation. I think this is an appropriate forum to be having this discussion, especially at a point in time when many are making efforts so that independent journalism be challenged. I think, in fact, we will have a great deal of agreement as far as what the challenges are. But I would like to make some distinctions regarding the things that Marty and Roberto said. Roberto said that one of the great challenges in the media is to continue to exist. It's very survival, given the new model. We have been seeing through this, we've seen this through the last 15 years, and this is where I would like to make a differentiation. And just to contribute one more thing to the discussion. For example, the media as an industry and journalism as a trade. In the past, journalism was not at risk except a place of employment, but the discipline was not under attack as it is today. And in this sense, I think that we should alert those around us that it is not only the business, but it is what we do. It is our profession. Our contribution to societies is what is under attack in the United States. We see it visibly since President Trump came to power. But even more than saying that it is somebody's responsibility or not, I think we should need to see that that person being elected is the consequence of what is going on. These tribal divisions mentioned by Mr. Holstein, divisions. We are societies divided into tribes, and we feed our own prejudices through an algorithm, the mythical algorithm of the networks, and we lose increasingly the public forum, the place of social encounter to have debates, to hold debates, or social media have brought this, reinforcing the prejudice of these tribes at a point in time where the pendulum of history is moving in the opposite direction. I am a Salvadorian, and I have to say that we are witnessing the end of the post-Cold War system, this system where we were promised democracy, and through democracy we were promised a solution to all our social evils. But no, this solution never arrived. And globalization as an economic model that was going to extricate us all from poverty. That didn't happen either. So we are seeing the pendulum moving in the other direction. But in this sense, journalism is essential in democratic governments. But if we don't have essential values, then journalism is not an essential value anymore either. I think this is a juncture, and I don't want to sound very exaggerated and dramatic, but there are dark forces that have acquired more power globally, and we can focus also regionally, as in Central America, which is my part of the world. But we could say that the antagonists are authoritarianism on the one hand, and democracy. We have the tribes as the antagonists of values that had been permeated, tolerance, inclusion, etc., and isolation and nationalism as antagonists of the globalization phenomenon, which came with the end of that history that we had been promised. And these are the distinctions I would like to make related to these large challenges that have been mentioned by Roberto and Marty so far. Thank you. And now Carlos Raimundo Roberts. Thank you very much. In fact, Catalina, what I was going to say has already been said here. And so I wanted to thank the CAF and the Inter-American Dialogue. I will return my money. I go back to Buenos Aires. No, I'm just going to try and say it in a different way. But we were asked about the challenges for the press. I think I would say that the old challenges are there are the old attacks to freedom of press. They are still alive, and we have new ones. Today, I received the report from the Freedom report from the SIP, and today we see a new episode in Latin America. It is amazing. Every day we generate one episode against the freedom of press, and that still persists. So we have, in addition to the older challenges, the newer ones coming from the digital world, which is, yes, wonderful. We don't know how we used to live before the media, the digital media, that we used to do absolutely everything. But for the press, there is an extraordinary challenge with the new media. We know the fake news, the trolls, the manipulation of the public through the algorithm. Before, we used to be scared because, oh, Videla, Pinochet, Chavez, Maduro, Mr. Trump or General Trump. But now we are scared because of the general algorithm, because we're being attacked from every which way. And these are the challenges from the digital press. And there's yet another one that has been mentioned by all of the preceding speakers, and it is the sustainable business model. But if we talk in those terms, sustainability of the business model, it's the same risk as a corporation. No, I think to be in risk is a human right of people to be well informed. And the way in which we see it in the global ecosystem, people are getting more and more information, but they are increasingly misinformed. We have freedom of expression and freedom of press, which are cousins. They used to go everywhere together, but they are now in conflict. Freedom of expression is as huge as it's ever been. People express themselves everywhere through all medias, and it is in competition with the freedom of press, because more and more we see that there's information circulating, but who curates that information? Who orders this information? Who edits this information?
There are a lot of people. If we were to say no one can speak here, no one is allowed to speak, they would say that we are curtailing the freedom of expression. If I said, yes, let's all together now, then we'd have a problem, because there would not be information, there would be noise. So what I think the world has to ask itself isn't the issue of just 4 press companies or 5,000. The question we have to ask ourselves is, we're headed toward societies that are going to be misinformed. disinformed. Now, the work of journalists and editors who say we've got so much information that it's all tripping over each other. And so I can say, well, I'll try to put order to it. I'll try to help make this understandable. So curating this content, the information presented by, that is the work of journalists, it's at risk. And why is it risk? Because 80% of the world's population is monopolized by Google or Facebook. That's 80% of the world's news through those outlets. So we have to ask ourselves, if that isn't a monopoly, you who work as a lawyer, Catalina, I work with legislation, and in Europe we see that they're starting to place some strictures on Google and Facebook. But the challenge is, do we want to become a society with tons of information without freedom of press, journalists, but no freedom of press? Thank you. So, Marty, there are three questions around which this first part revolves as far as the independent questions here. How much in the United States, how much power does the president have in the United States to destabilize the press? Does the president have the ability to destabilize press? Are U.S. institutions strong enough? Are they shielded enough to not allow for a president to truly do away with the content of the First Amendment? Now, that has to do with this issue of the echo chambers. Now, and why did we elect him? Because it's not just the president that's the problem. It's we elected the president. That's the problem. So can the press break that echo chamber before it itself is destroyed? Do the conditions exist for the press to break down that echo chamber? And between unequals, can there be a dialogue in which each is willing to hear the other and to close a triangle here? There are threats against the business in the U.S., do you think, or have you achieved in the United States a model that enables you to overcome these economic challenges that have been mentioned here?
Thanks. Well, look, I mean, first of all, the dangers that the president presents to us, can he do a lot of damage? I think the answer to that is yes, he can. The presidency in the United States, notwithstanding the system that we have here, where there's supposedly a balance of power, right now we don't see a lot of balance of power, and the president himself, even under normal circumstances, has quite a bit of power in the United States. What he has been able to do is to cause doubts in a huge segment of the population about the legitimacy of the press, the veracity of the press, whether anything that we write, anything that we broadcast, anything that we air in any forum is legitimate unless it comes from him. He wants there to be only one source of information, and that would be himself. And so what we see is what was talked about earlier, which was that people have divided themselves into tribes. Now, this didn't just happen during the Trump administration. This has been happening for some time, largely because of the phenomena that we've talked about already. But it has been aggravated during the election and during the last year and a half of the Trump administration as well. And so what we find is a society that is increasingly polarized. A certain segment of the population believes these sources of information, has great confidence in them. Another segment of the population has no confidence in those sources of information, and that segment has confidence only in other sources of information. So we get our information from different sources. We live in our own information bubbles. And so, the question you ask is whether the press is able to sort of break that phenomenon. And I would say the answer to that is not yet, and not now, and I'm not sure when or if ever, because people are getting information from hundreds, if not thousands, of different sources, some of them reliable, some of them really good that weren't available, I'm sorry to say, prior to the internet, and I think that that's healthy, that there should be more open sources of information. But the downside is that they're getting all sorts of bad information from other sources. They're getting outright falsehoods, lies, misinformation, they're being exploited, there are conspiracy theories that are not true. And so all of this is spreading out there, and a president and others have the capacity to exploit that system for their own benefit. I don't think at the moment the traditional press, the mainstream press, has the capacity to overcome that. What we can be is true to our own values, true to ourselves, true to our principles, and hope that over time, over the long run, not in the short run, that people will see that the information that we're publishing is reliable because it's been validated over the long run.
¿Y el modelo de negocio está amenazado como está amenazado en América Latina?
Our business? Well, you know, I think our business is not threatened by what's happening at the Washington Post. Fortunately, we are in a privileged position because we are now a national news organization and even an international news organization, and that makes us much stronger than if we were strictly a local news organization. It helps that we publish in English, obviously. I think media that publish in other languages have a far greater challenge than we do. But we have been able to, because we've transformed ourselves for the digital era in a very successful way, we now have what we believe to be a sustainable business model, or at least we're on the path to a sustainable business model. The greatest challenge, and that's probably true of the major outlets here, certainly the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the major networks are all pretty much on, I think, firm footing, and then some magazines that have found their niche as well. The greatest challenge here in the United States is to local and regional press, ones with traditional newspaper backgrounds. They have been unable to find a successful business model, and the most severe crisis in the United States is with those kinds of publications as opposed to our publication. We have plenty of challenges, but they're not nearly as great as those.
Gracias, Mari.
Roberto. So democracy is a process of selecting preferences through the election process, and to elect you have to have information, and what has been made evident here is that there's a lot of noise. People don't know how to thresh out truth from lies, and we have a process in Colombia in which we have a plebiscite voting process in which there was much effort to spread disinformation, disinformation campaign. Now, in the peace process with the FARC, there was a gender ideology, it was said, that was encrypted, and that's crazy. There was nothing encrypted. It was simply a way of mobilizing the ultra-conservative groups against the peace accord, and that information spread through WhatsApp groups, basically. Now, how can we keep WhatsApp groups from having as much credibility as the most important widespread or widely read paper in Colombia? How can we get people to understand that these WhatsApp groups might be vehicles of disinformation? The easy response is to do your job well, journalistically speaking. That is, to do your research, your investigation, contrasting viewpoints. Generally speaking, that's the approach. But I think here also there's an overplaying of this concept, an exaggeration, because yes, there are new vehicles of expression, and there are always lies in any electoral process, but not necessarily because there were lies is going to be the reason why one wins or loses over the other. Perhaps the winning margin was small. Now, it's not that the Colombian society would have thought entirely differently had those lies been shut down immediately. What's happening here is that the society is divided in two. Why? Usually, we try to when people don't agree with what we think, they try to magnify their viewpoint. Now, given this proliferation of social networks, for example, I would imagine it's the same situation with the Catholic Church when the print press emerged. We didn't want comments and opinions to be published that were contrary to the church back then. So it's the same situation now. Anyone now can reach as many people as any of our outlets and can say the lies that have always been said, but in a more massive way, those lies can be broadcast. This is nothing new here. This is just increasing the volume of the loudspeaker. So when you have a rumor, you have gossip that once went as far as the neighbor next door, now the whole country can hear it. So the only thing we can do is to do our job well, because we cannot police information that we don't produce. All we can do is compete seriously to ensure that people say, we're the ones who say the truth. Well, truth perhaps isn't the right word, it's a complex concept, but we are the people who deal with information in a more responsible way than those who do otherwise, and that's what makes us more trustworthy. So, for example, information put out by German Nazis, these are true engineers who come up with these algorithms on Facebook, for example, tailoring messages to preferences of groups, and this is done in a massive way. It's far more efficient, powerful, far-reaching than in the Nazi times, let's say, but there's nothing new about what's being done. We have seen this before, so let's not get too frightened by this, because this is just a matter of the volume. Now, you talked about self-criticism. What is the self-criticism you would make? I would say self-criticism, self-critiquing. I think that the position that we have taken on in society as journalists, I think that we have been arrogant, that in many cases has led us to distance ourselves from society so much that we're not seeing things happening right in front of our nose, like the Brexit in England, or the fact that the no vote in Colombia won, or Trump in Colombia, or Trump won in the United States. And people in our midst had these thoughts, and we didn't see it. And so we have become too withdrawn from society. We have lost that feeling, the ability to understand, and then we get upset and we criticize, or we are criticized for not understanding. We need to level that criticism against ourselves. If you're saying one thing and people are saying something entirely different, well, that's our mistake. It would be more intelligent, more reasonable, more sensible, responsibly socially, if we just got off of our pedestal, rolled up our sleeves, and got into where the people are, and put our finger on the pulse of what people are actually thinking. Thank you, Roberto. Carlos, how do you carry out journalism in a region in which you have a country that is hard hit by the maras, or the gangs, Salvatrucha maras, as an example, Nicaragua, which is an open dictatorship? 400 people have already been murdered. People have been tortured, sexually violated, and the press is under siege. Guatemala, in which the press has been captured by this gentleman Gonzalez. And the few independent journalists that do exist, if the large media outlets have problems with their business model, Nicaragua media outlets have always had them. And so when the investigator from CICIG, the International Group Against Impunity, is not even allowed, is ousted from the country, and that person isn't allowed to do his job. This is a powder keg. How do you carry out journalism such as your outlet, The Faro, in a region like this? Well, perhaps it's crazy to think about doing journalism in this region. Now, I think that we're at a breaking point in Central America. We don't know exactly at what point that might happen. You've described the situation very well. You just left out Honduras, in which there's a president who was re-elected by declaring the Constitution unconstitutional and through fraud, and who has been sponsored by the attaché, the Charge d'Affaires of the United States. And then you've got Jimmy Morales in Guatemala as well. And so there are powerful forces in the societies that sustain them. Now, oftentimes, rarely do we talk about the economic groups that make this possible. Nicaragua is a perfect example, because in Nicaragua, the Sandinista revolution, the socialist revolutionary Sandinista government of Ortega was capable of eliminating its opposition, re-electing Ortega, and curtailing freedom of expression in the process, and shutting down all opposition in the country, thanks to the support of the most powerful businessmen in the country. Now, we heard throughout Latin America the great benefits of the system. Now, 300 students have died in Nicaragua, and now these businessmen from Nicaragua say, well, we hadn't realized that these things were happening in our country. We have a dictatorship that's awful, and the students are still being killed, imprisoned, and being tortured in the Chipotle prison. And the opposition that has become kind of a weird or strange opposition has not been capable of getting the private sector to declare a strike, a general strike, because they're still standing by to see what's going to happen next. The president of that business union has not yet been changed out, and that was the person who sung the praises of the current president for 10 years now. So you've got a revolutionary dictatorship from the left on the one hand, and then you've got the president of the Traditional National Party of Honduras. In that country, it's the same thing. As a journalist, Catalina, I spent 3 months in Nicaragua, and I covered the re-election process of Hernandez. And the only thing for me that sets them apart is that in Honduras, from the first people who died, I knew that the first people who died wouldn't bring about any good. These were free deaths, so to speak. In Nicaragua, however, the first protests instilled much hope, because these were demonstrations that emerged from the heart of a student community that did not have a political agenda driving them, that did not have any other interest than to just express their indignation, and for this they suffered more and more deaths. Now, this has been a movement that has been noble and joyful at the same time. This is what instilled hope. Now, today, they find themselves exactly at the same point they were when they began. Among other things, thanks to the OES efforts, which is an organization that needs to take a hard look at what it's for, because it really hasn't done enough when it was needed. Now, in Central America, we've gone through this whole post-war period from the 80s on, with the holding out the hope of a democratic progress. And what we've seen is that we've been trying to develop mechanisms of accountability and greater transparency, sometimes emerging from the immediate needs of a country, as in the case of Guatemala, and that's why CICIG came in, which was set up to purge and to clean the system of that corruption. Now you've got the MAXI, that is in Honduras, the OES rather than the UN oversight international body. Now we're backtracking. MAXI was weakened in its work with the government, and it has brought cases against some of the lower house representatives. Now, in Guatemala, when CICIG started to touch on some interests that weren't only of the minister and vice minister, these are economic interests, then it was an attempt was made to eviscerate CICIG, and that's what we're seeing right now. There is backsliding, a reversal of the trend in Central America. The U.S. Has lost credibility in the region and hence has less influence. When a country calls a region a shithole, separating children from their parents at the border, 250,000 families are being returned to El Salvador by the United States, and on top of that, they're going to tell us how to do things. Now, the influence and authority of the U.S. in the region has diminished considerably. Corruption and organized crime are true threats to journalism. That is, 5 years ago, I would have been surprised to hear myself saying this now, but El Salvador, of the 4 countries that you've mentioned, is the most stable of them and the safest place for journalists to work. Now, in Nicaragua, the persecution of the press has not received as much information as it should be, because it's an urgent situation. In Guatemala, what we see in the provinces and in Honduras, it's essentially impossible to carry out journalism in the provinces because that means death to any journalist who does his job there. So authoritarianism, organized crime, which end up being one and the same. These are the main threats for my colleagues, fellow journalists in the region. And what can be done? The Organization of American States, the Inter-American Human Rights Commission, the Freedom of Expression, Rapporteurship from the UN, and so forth. You who are there on the ground, what do you think can be done? Let's go back to what we said before, because, Catalina, that is why this is important, because when institutions and democracy don't redound to benefit, well, all of that becomes secondary. All of these letters of good intentions, international agreements, conventions signed at the UN don't amount to much when they're not upheld by the biggest powers of the world. If the great powers of the world give short shrift to international treaties signed on at the UN, then they're not going to do any good for us. They haven't helped us improve our quality of life. If independent press has also not made it possible for us to transform the institutions of our societies, giving us better living conditions, then none of that amounts to anything. And it makes no sense now. And I'll say one more thing about El Salvador. Since the 1992 peace accords, we have a political system that is bipolar. The extreme right, the party founded by the leader of the death squadrons and the paramilitary groups, Arena, and fighting against the extreme left, and also those who carried out the guerrilla warfare there, that is, our democracy is in the hands of these two parties that existed then until today. Now, for the first time, we're going to have an election in which the candidate who's leading in the polls doesn't belong to either one of these two parties, and really doesn't belong to any party. This is a new candidate, an outsider, who signed on to any old party just so he can compete, and that is the one who is the front runner. Now, what does this candidate promise us? Simply to not be like the other ones. That's all he has to offer. And that's no small thing. So this is a rupture point, because our political system did not bear the fruit that it promised us. And ultimately, that is what explains why the plaza in Guatemala didn't fill up after the president's announcement 2 days ago. That's why many people who started the revolt in Nicaragua are now in exile in neighboring countries. That also explains why in Honduras they were capable of orchestrating an electoral fraud of obscene proportions, and so you can say, unlike what many lawyers might think, we pinned our hope on law, international standards, legal certainty, and so forth. Well, you're right, Cantalita. The problem is that politics also needs justice in order to enforce these laws. And the system of laws and rights that you talk about, that utopia, we need to purge the political system of the corrupt people. Now, those who capture judges, for example, the judges that are punishing the journalists. That's why, if you were to ask what is the challenge of the press, I would say more than the subsistence of the business model, which is a part of it, but the big challenge that we face throughout the world is to continue being relevant, just being germane. That is the true challenge. Carlos. Now, in Argentina right now, there's a scandal that's being compared to the big scandals in Brazil, for example, Lava Jato and others, which is the notebooks. After many months of investigation, and so this is ultimately turned over to the judicial authorities, and then it is released. And this has teetering on the edge those who were in power for a long time. But a big part of the population holds that what we're really seeing here is a political attack, an attack carried out by the media, as was said about Lava Jato against O Globo in Brazil. And so this is what they say, that it's the extreme right striking out against progressive parties. What's the defense there? Well, I have no defense. They're right. This is a very interesting topic, and it's very much related to what we've been talking about here. I don't know if everyone here knows about the issue of the notebooks. This is a driver, who, during 10 years, over 10 years, was driving for the second highest up in the Ministry of Federal Planning, which was the one in charge of public works, and there was a corruption scheme. That is, the company that received the job would get a kickback, a commission. Now, there were many public works and so many kickbacks, and many cars driving around picking up these banks of money or kickbacks. And so this had to be done personally. It couldn't be sent. And so the driver was very efficient. This was a driver with good cars and good companies that would visit the big companies that paid the kickback. And so what did he do? So he would write down in his notebook, September 14th, Tuesday, we are at Libertador, San Martin, 1520. I got down to take the money from the Magoya company, $200,000. Now, how did the driver, Centeno, know about the $200,000? 10 years he spent counting the money. He knew exactly how much the bags weighed, how much fit in a bag, in a portfolio, and he took note of everything. And that was all taken down in the notebook. Now, this hero of the story was part of the corruption scheme. He had a lot of cars in his auto transport company, but he had the notebook. I don't know if anyone uses notebooks anymore. This is something an old-timer does, but he still had his fountain pen and his notebook. And so the Kirchner government comes to an end. He loses his job. He ends up working in some city, and his ex-wife, who was very upset because he left her, takes the notebook to the court and says, "My former husband, Centeno, used to hit me." And he also has some notebooks there, and it's all written down. It's all written down in the notebooks. And that's how the story started. So one day, when Centeno realizes that his wife had gone and spoken to the authorities, he grabbed all of the notebooks, 8 notebooks. He took the 8 notebooks and he gave them in safekeeping to a former police officer, someone he trusted, and he says, I'm going to give you a box with these notebooks, and please save these for me. The police said, what's this about? Well, I'll tell you later. He didn't know what it was. It could have been a bomb. It could have been a woman. What is it? He said, no, I have these notebooks, and I'll explain to you later what they are. And so this former police officer, retired, received this and said, okay, leave him here with me. And the former police officer, who was against the Kitcheners, said, this is a pot of gold. This is a treasure. What do I do with this? Without saying anything to the owner of the notebooks, to the one who wrote these notebooks, he said, it's incredible how these stories are written. And so next to him lived a journalist, his neighbor. And so years ago, this journalist had carried out an investigation into another act of corruption. And in this book, he had given it to the police officer, signed, autographed copy. And so the police officer went to the author of this book, and this police officer bought the book, and he asked the journalist living next door to him to autograph it, and they became friends. And so then, when the police officer received the notebooks, he decided, well, I can't believe, and so he gave it to the journalist, and the journalist said, I can't believe that this was given to me without having to pay anything. And so he started reading through them. He said, this is incredible. This is impressive. So now, 2 or 3 people from the paper realized they had a problem. Well, this is breaking news. One of the most important bits of breaking news in the history of Argentina. And he said, I can't publish anything?
I can't publish this because Centeno doesn't know I have this, and he's going to deny. And so he consulted with 2 or 3 people in the newspaper, and the 2 or 3 people agree, hey, the only way is that you say, I received these notebooks, go to the judge. A gentleman came, gave this to me. He says it's this and that. And so let the judge do his or her part. And he did something for the history of journalism. He decides, no, I will leave the scoop to the side. He investigated it, and he went to the young people from the master that you mentioned. We are going to do all the investigation with all the license plates, names, everything. Yes, and so they checked everything. They checked every single piece of information, and he went to the bars where they used to go pay their bribes, their kickbacks, and so he would call the business people to those bars and ask them, what did you do at this bar on such and such a day? Yeah, didn't you meet as a government official? Yeah, well, sure, I had forgotten. He met with everyone, but the investigation he had, that body of investigation, he couldn't publish it. He couldn't publish it, so he went to the judge, and then they did the investigation. Now, there were 2 risks there. Giving it to the judicial system in Argentina is just to throw it overboard in the ocean. I guess it will disappear quicker if you give it to the judges in Argentina that you throw it overboard. But the other possibility is that maybe it would appear in the Clarín, the other newspaper. For example, yes, and that they would sell that information to another news media, and that information was quite expensive. So he was lucky. He took it to a judge, where the judge and the prosecutor wanted to investigate, and they were independent, and so they did their own investigation in the court. But an interesting point here is that La Nación didn't have the scoop. It was published at the same time in all newspapers. So La Nación didn't have the scoop the first day that they went to give the arrest warrants to all the business people and the officers. So La Nación may have lost the scoop, but they won a place in history. We didn't have the scoop, but obviously in the end they all realized that it was an investigation carried out by La Nación. And I'm sorry, I apologize because I spoke a little too much, but the question you asked me about the accusations, the notebooks, this is the intimate story of the notebooks. There are no external factors, complications. No, someone who received a notebook and that person passed it on to the journalist. He knew he was his neighbor. The notebooks were not important, and they were just famous for 2 weeks because all of them admitted they had paid a bribe, and several officers said, yes, we would receive the bribe. But so the notebooks were no longer as important, but on page 12, one of the leftist newspapers because the notebooks, as I was saying, lost their newsiness, but they had. So Centeno, the driver, said to his friend, the former cop, told him, oh, give me my notebooks back. And Basigalupo, who was the former cop, told the journalist, oh, give me back the notebooks. So he had scanned everything, but he had to. So what he had to give the court were the photocopies. And so on page 12, Página 12, who is the leftist newspaper, so they used to call the case, oh, the notebook case, the notebooks, but they used to call it, no, it's not the notebook case, it's the photocopy case. So they wanted to. But they all ultimately admitted they had been received the money, and those who had paid it, etc. So, as I was telling you, this is the truth of the story. Those were the notebooks, and this shows the importance, and it is connected to what we were discussing earlier and what Carlos was saying here. Among those of us who are not wearing the ties, our colleagues on the other side are so serious. They have their ties on. We don't. Anyway. At any rate, but he was referring to the importance of the existence of the media. Basigalupo, the former cop, didn't go to social media. He went to a reporter he knew would guarantee that all this investigation would be treated very seriously. And I apologize again for taking up a lot of time. Yes, your story is wonderful. Thank you. But how does the press answer someone who wants to destroy the reputation? So someone as a group from WhatsApp that wants to destroy the reputation of a traditional, serious newspaper. If Pinochet, Videla, Daniel Ortega Maduro, or Fidel Castro accuses me, it will be an asset for me. I will feel as though I had received a prize. If Kirchner people say that, it will also be a boon for me that General Trump is always against the New York Times, against the Washington Post. It is an asset for them. I think the number of subscriptions has increased. I mean, I think they're doing great, right? So maybe you are going to pay tribute to Trump. But I want to say that your question can only be answered by telling the episode, the question, how do you answer the question that right-wing media are doing this to destroy the reputation of the administration or whatever. This is how we do it. We have to tell the story. There is no speech that can allow us to explain it, only the actions. You speak the truth. We take the truth to the court. And we didn't even want to take the scoop and be the ones to come out with the breaking news. That is the story, and I think that is exactly the way. Yes, maybe I should have given you the mic because you really summarized what I intended to do exactly. Yes. For the next question, I'm going to refer it back to Roberto with one condition, but I will loan you my tie. But not only the accusation against the right-wing media or the ones that are terrorists. Martinelli did the same thing with the media that were on the other side of the aisle from him. So we need to do our work well. That's here in the United States. The media, certain media, are being privileged because they are the subject of attacks from the government. But the answer is to do our job well. Sometimes we get angry. Of course, we're human, but there is no other way out. We need to do our work. You tell me I'm lying, but I'll show you I'm not lying. And my commitment to truth and the seriousness of my profession is my answer, because it is easy to start having ideological discussions, and we always lose out when we do this. Monica Gonzalez has an investigative center. Not only does she do significant journalistic investigations, but the scandal of priests who have molested children in Chile, and this has been a big scandal. She worked in that. And also how to do good journalism, like Fundamedios in Ecuador and the Garcia Marquez Institute in Colombia. But yes, thank you for referring to my agency. And Monica Gonzalez is the editor of El Faro. Yes, so I wanted to say that media need some oversight, of course. And this is why it's important to have those centers, those research and investigation centers. We have 15 minutes left. I don't know if no, I wanted to add something. I want to contribute something. We decided to bring the reader ombudsman, which is different from the trends in the United States, where the reader ombudsman is no longer existence. We decided to open this possibility because it's a way in which we can answer our questions. The reader is entitled to doubt your information, and there is someone to defend the rights of the person, that ombudsperson. So, in fact, the salary comes from donations from the readers and not from funds from the newspaper. And this is a way in which we can respond to legitimate suspicions from the readers regarding veracity of the information. On the other hand, also to educate the readers, so the ombudsperson will help them understand how to detect veracity or lying in journalism. Thank you very much. Now we will have some questions from the audience, and maybe you will answer, but I don't see, I can't see. Okay, there is someone raising their hands, but we also need the microphones. We apologize. There is interpretation. The interpreters need to have a microphone to be able to interpret. Oh, so you would have to come to the two mics down here. I can't repeat it then.
Press, and it seems that the press is helping him in situations like Brian Ross at ABC, Brian Williams at NBC, CNN last week having to walk back the reporting around Leon Davis. I'm just wondering if the press could help itself by being a little bit more diligent, the way that, say, the Washington Post was around All the President's Men, with that famous scene with Ben Bradley at his doorstep saying, you know, we need to check and recheck this before we rush it out and risk the credibility of the press.
While you,
Is that a question for me? Yeah.
Obviously.
Look, I mean, I think we've talked here a bit about being self-critical. I think that we should be self-critical. I think that first of all, we have to recognize that the press is not without its flaws. We have flaws because we're human beings, so we make mistakes. We make mistakes like people in any other profession, and there is no person in any other profession who is perfect, and we're not perfect either. That said, I think that the reporting on the president has been, by the mainstream news outlets, has been actually quite good. Many of the things, probably most of the things, if not all of the things that the president has said were untrue, have turned out over time to be validated by the facts that emerged, even to the point where he acknowledged that they were true. I mean, one key example is when he said that when his administration flatly denied that he had dictated the response of Donald Trump Jr., about the meeting that was held in Trump Tower with Russians. We reported at the time that he dictated that statement, that he was personally involved, and that he actually dictated the exact words that were to be in that statement. And everyone associated with his administration, including himself, denied that that was true. And later on, when having to deal with the special counsel, they sent a letter to the special counsel which said that, in fact, he had dictated that statement. That was a flat-out lie on the part of the president. And there have been any number of other examples along those lines where, with time, the reporting has been validated. And I think that, you know, as we were talking here about, okay, well, what can we do to respond to these attacks on the press? Ultimately, we have to be faithful to our values and our standards and our principles. The reporting has to be solid, and it has to be borne out over time. And I think that we have to think in the long run. If you think, you mentioned Watergate. Well, at the time that the Watergate investigation was being conducted by the Washington Post, primarily by the Washington Post, the Washington Post was under severe attack from the Nixon administration at the time. And there were huge segments of the population, the supporters of Richard Nixon, who felt that that reporting was partisan, completely partisan, and had no basis in fact, because the president said so, and because his vice president, his initial vice president, Spiro Agnew, said so. Well, it turned out that that reporting turned out to be true. Now today, as people look back at Watergate, they say, oh, well, all that reporting was solid, but the reporting today is not. But at the time, the reporting on Watergate was highly criticized, as being absolutely false by the administration and its supporters. And this is what we're facing today from this administration, is severe criticism. But as it turns out that over time, over the months and over the years, this reporting is now being validated.
Gracias, Marín. No sé si hay más preguntas.
Thank you, Marty. I don't know if someone else has a question. Can you please come to the microphones for...
Qualley. I'm a lawyer in New York, Sidley Austin, but I taught law at a university in Bogota called Los Andes a few years ago. It seems to me the issue that we're talking about here is the role of press keeping people honest. Politicians keeping them honest, and business keeping them honest, to use the example of Argentina and Brazil recently. The opportunities to keep people honest have come from very brave either prosecutors or judges, in the case of Brazil, or in the case of the press, the ability to have the money to do the investigations that you need to undertake. And what can you do to either have an ombudsman so that you are protecting sources that come forward to the government and that the security, the safety of the reporters are protected if they dig in and do an investigation and either bring the problem to the attention of either the press or to the government? What can you do to provide security to your reporters and your investigation and funding for them, whether it's funding by the business sector, because ultimately you need to make money. So that would be my question. How can you help in both those areas, the security, funding, and then the integrity of the enforcement people, the judges and the prosecutors?
Muy bien, muchas gracias. No sé si hay alguna otra pregunta y recogemos.
Allá había una, allá arriba.
Yes, are there any more questions? Yes, I see someone up there. Don, did you have a question? Someone there? Yes? And you? 1, 2, 3, 4, okay? And that will be it. No, yes, 5. And then you will have a few minutes to answer each question. I spent 31 years in State Department in Latin America, and always blah, blah, blah regarding democracy and freedom of the press. And our leaders, and now this distinguished correspondent is calling him General Trump. I'm a Republican, but our president is a disaster, revolting human being. What does the free press think? Those who have heard my speeches from John F. Kennedy and the freedom of the press and democracy, when you see the disaster that Washington is going through right now, and what does the press think? What do they write about? And what does the people, what do people say here and now? I don't know. Can you please know who went first? I think he was first, and then here, and then there, and then in the back, and that will be it, right? Yes, thank you. I wanted to make a comment. I come from Peru, and I have spent a great deal of time, more than half my life in Peru, and I have worked in politics, journalism, written press. I have written in newspapers for many years, and I wanted to ask whether you have a comment, and also from the Washington Post. I hope you understand my question regarding the sustainability of the business model, and also regarding journalism. In my country, we used to say that this could be the greatest of virtues, or the evilest of businesses. In this case, journalism in my country, Peru, we have a newspaper from the 20s and 30s that was linked to the oligarchs and the powers that be. And ideologically, journalists were drawn to that newspaper. It was El Comercio, that was the name of the newspaper. But over time, could you please let me know what you think about the tensions that are experienced by for example, the owners of a newspaper that may be a family, and there are different ways in which the families manage their property, their company, and the relationship with journalists that are seeking to find the truth. And I know of many cases, both male and female journalists who are fired, or they are told they leave and they are given maybe a severance package, but if they please leave. But the Diario La República or El Comercio in Peru, there can be those situations too. I would like to know your opinion about this. It is related to the essence of the task of the journalist, which is seeking the truth. When you have to confront the powers that be, either with the cuadernos or notebooks cases or the lavajato, and if at the highest levels of government, the president himself, as in this case, creates tension. So the experience of the very distinguished journalist, the colleague from Washington Post, from El Tiempo, from Bogota, or the colleague from El Salvador, or from La Nación in Buenos Aires, I would like to know how you deal with these tensions that can exist within a company, a newspaper that may be owned by a family with a different ideology than the journalist. Yes, you spoke more than us. All right. Very interesting, your question, however. Yes, can you hear me? Yes, I have a brief comment, Catalina. Yes, and a question. The comment, and I perfectly understand what Carlos Dada feels when he discusses the OAS. And if you heard what the Secretary General of the OAS said, Carlos, he mentioned significant points, because I think the words with which he talked about the political situation of some of the countries in the region is very different from what could have been the lack of activity of the OAS some years ago. If you compare the OAS today to the one 2.5 years ago, where only the Secretary General and 2 countries would make presentations about the situation in these countries, especially Venezuela, and you compare it to the reality today, at least now we have 25 countries who are supporting more direct postures vis-a-vis the situation of the violation of human rights, lack of guarantees, and all the other things going on in that country. So something is changing, and it's changing for the better. We need to repeat the sentence of Alberto Lleras: the OAS will be what the member states want it to be, and that is part of the reality we have. But the Secretary General, if the states cannot reach an agreement, then the Secretary General and under the charter of the OAS makes decisions and makes postures, and this is important as well. But the OAS, as Catalina said, the rapporteur, she was for freedom of expression, and the Commission on Human Rights, etc. So I just want to leave you with this brief comment. The United Nations has tried for many years to approve a resolution against Syria, and it has not been possible. And nobody says, well, let's close the United Nations. It's part of the reality of what happens when you have these mechanisms, these agencies, and we need to try and use the spaces in the best way possible. I have a question for Martin. When the media, in an extreme polarization situation that we're seeing in different places, when you then go to the specific tribes, won't you then locate yourselves in those niches, and then won't you end up having media that are specialized and only for those tribes? So we have very little time left, and okay, so Marcelo Jesus is my name. I come from Argentina. I live in the United States, and in fact, I am very happy to have been here and heard all the different presentations. These are journalists with different backgrounds, different countries. However, I think they have all agreed on what it is that makes good quality journalism real. The reason I'm here is because of my children. My children are the ones who need to have a true idea of what journalism is.
I have to compete with Instagram, with Twitter, and I tried to, those papers that I continue to buy in hard copy or digital versions in Argentina, I try to stay connected to Argentina, but my problem is generational. The leap from direct communication, those people that my children follow, not the press presented in an orderly way. And so my question then is, what can we do? How can we build a bridge between the generations so that my children can read journals or newspapers like yours? There was a question in back. If you could find a microphone. I think I'm going to get in trouble here with the microphone. I just have two very short questions. Santiago Rodriguez, I'm a student of international relations at American University. A general question first and then a specific question. So, we find ourselves now with a society in which there are so many different players who are seeking out the truth. Journalists, that's their job. And then you've got Facebook, which regulates information, taking down posts if they think it's a hate speech or if it violates its use or privacy policies. And it's not really press, but determining what the truth is for us. And so my question is, don't you think that in the long term that could become a threat for the exercise of journalism? Because should it not be the journalists who, through their research investigations, decide what's true and not some Facebook like outlet that is deciding what's true and what isn't and taking down things it deems not true? Now, when you talk about coming down from the pedestal and getting down amidst the people, is there some specific thing that your paper, El Tiempo, is doing that would actually promote that behavior? A minute each.
Okay. Quickly, on the security of reporters, look, one of the reasons there are a lot of people who are sources, they can't go to the government because they know they won't be protected, particularly sources who work in government. And that's why they come to us, and that's why we protect their anonymity. One way that we protect anonymity is that we have means that people can send us information in an encrypted fashion, and then we report it out. We don't just take what they say. We try to understand, first of all, who they are, and what their agenda might be, and then do additional reporting. Regarding the question that was directed straight to me about the polarization and whether this means that media is going to gravitate toward different to tribes of their own, essentially become highly specialized. I fear that that's happening right now. I think that people have seen the success of Fox News, and so you see that what's happened with MSNBC has decided to become essentially a kind of Fox News of the left. I know that there are organizations like ours have decided. We say flatly in the Washington Post, an independent newspaper, we are very determined to be independent. I'm in charge of our news coverage. I'm not in charge of our opinion pages. The opinion pages, of course, have their opinions. But one thing is we want to be independent. We want to do investigative reporting on people regardless of party, regardless of ideology, regardless of any political leanings or any other affiliations that they might have. And so that's what we try to do. As far as reaching, I'll just address the question of younger readers and how to build it. Look, I just spent the weekend with my niece. I gave her a free subscription to the Washington Post. I asked her whether she continued that subscription. She said no, she gets her information off of Twitter and Instagram and what have you. So I gave her another free month to see if that would work. So it's a huge challenge, no question about it. But one thing that we're seeing at the Washington Washington Post is that an increasing number of our subscribers are coming from the millennial generation. I think people are beginning to discover, at least I hope they're beginning to discover, that unless they pay for quality news, they won't get quality news. And that there are sources of information that have been around for quite some time, who have been faithful to their principles, their values, and whose reporting has been validated over the long run. And they are beginning to feel that, well, I should have those kinds of sources of information. They're more reliable than some of the other sources that I've been depending on over the last several years, and they are beginning to subscribe to us.
Gracias, Mario.
Bueno, así saltando.
Many questions were asked. Let's talk about the safety of journalists. Yes, we do need to provide physical security, guarantee the physical safety of our journalists. That's a responsibility we have, especially those of us who work in countries where we have violence, especially as a result of denouncing acts of corruption. There is risk entailed. It's a risk that there isn't more money for investigation. It's necessary to do the investigation to ensure a sound information in the media, whether we're talking about corruption or the control of power by states, the power that states wield. Now, and the power of the rich. This is something that would merit its own panel. Sometimes a press outlet is saved by a rich person who buys it. And if those outlets are critical of their new rich owners, well, then they will go bankrupt. And so information for the whole society, that's really difficult for one outlet to omit information and that not be found out, or to publish something that others don't end up knowing about too. So when talking about journalism, and cases such as Trump, the important thing isn't what the media think about Trump, but what Trump thinks about the media. The problem doesn't arise from a questioning by the media of a Republican and non-Republican political stance, but the affirmation of the president that the media is lying about that. That is a very different phenomenon in our discussion. Now, this anguish or concern that our children should be reading the press we work at. No, I think we have to reach them. Otherwise, we will be lost, not that they have to read us. Now, on funding and security of journalists, I think there's not a whole lot I can add. I work at a paper founded by journalists whose owners are all journalists. It's not economically viable, but we've been at it for 20 years. I don't think it's a good model for anyone, but perhaps it serves as an inspiration for some journalists. On security, more than the security of the journalists, I would say that's our secondary safety. The first is the safety and security of our sources. We have to protect our sources and help them understand the danger they run. Now, the State Department.
Get in touch. I need to communicate with you. That's all my answer to you for now. Ya voy a llegar a la olla, José Luis. Las tensiones.
Now, in Peru, owners and journalists and the tension between them, rather than think about the tension that exists between the owners of news outlets and the journalists, that's everywhere. But I think the big inspiration in Peru emerged from Gustavo Gurite, a very brave journalist. A judge gave him 3 days to reveal his source, and he answered not in 3 days, nor in 30, nor in 300 days, because that goes against my principles. That's the true inspiration here. OAS, on the OAS. I don't speak of a Secretary General, I speak of an institution that with the prior Secretary General, someone whom I respect in many ways, Mr. Insulza, wasn't capable of, in 2009, putting the brakes on a coup d'etat in Honduras. And so, yes, the member states determine what the OAS is going to be, but I still think from the outside that the OAS is an extension of the political quotas of the governments of Latin American governments and the U.S. government as well. And so that's how the OAS needs to transform itself. And yes, you have the rapporteurship of freedom of expression, and you have the Inter-American Commission and courts of human rights that have played a very important role. And hopefully this OAS will ensure its existence and influence in our countries, which seems to be ever diminished. I'm not going to speak about the personal style of each Secretary General. I'm not referring to any Secretary General, but the institution. The last thing I wanted to say, to close with a positive note, a brilliant note, in that it illuminates all this darkness. I do believe that there is a good future for journalism. I think despite all of the adversities we face, if you look at the Panama Papers or Odebrecht, journalism in Latin America has been showing we are more prepared to work together. You've got journalists on the one hand, and you've got the media outlets and those companies. I think good Latin American journalism is helping to reshuffle and bring into line our political system. That's the hope that I have. Carlos, 1 minute. I won't go speak more than 5 minutes. Quickly. Marcelo from Argentina, who asks about his children. I have the same problem, 5 children. None reads the paper. They have grown up, and I bought them their clothes and fed them because I work at a paper. The problem isn't the paper. The problem is journalism. We're talking about platforms. It doesn't matter that they don't read the newspaper, but that they inform themselves through good journalism on whatever platform that exists now or in the future. Now, as far as my Peruvian friend here who talks about the problems, the responsibilities that journalists have and companies have, I would like to make a comparison here. Roberto said this as well. I would like to compare ourselves with doctors, as unusual as that might sound. My wife works as a poor doctor. There are all types of doctors. When I was a child, another century back, there was a book, Bisturi, that is the scalpel of the white mafia. That was the name of the book. Now, you have all types of doctors. Now, you've got those who are in cahoots with laboratories, and those who are serious, and those who are charlatans. But when I get sick, I go to the doctor. I don't go to Google. And so I think that people will continue to resort to journalism for the information. Thank you.
Thank you, Catalina, and members, for that fascinating discussion regarding the challenges to a free press. May I please have everyone's attention, as session 2 will begin in a moment. The discussion topic for this panel is China-Latin America relations, new perspectives for trade and investment. This session will be moderated by Isabel Hilton, editor of ChinaDialogue.net. Isabel is a London-based international journalist and broadcaster, and the founder and editor of ChinaDialogue.net, which is a non-profit bilingual online publication. Please welcome Isabel and members of the panel to the stage.
Yeah, where's my panel? Thank you. I was beginning to wonder where you'd all gone. I think everyone probably needs 5 minutes anyway. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to the session which will be looking at one of the biggest and most important developments in Latin America in the last decade, the arrival of China. As you've heard, my name is Isabel Hilton. I'm the founder and editor of a series of websites that look at China and its role in the world, including Diálogo Chino, which looks at China in Latin America. The arrival of China in Latin America has had an extraordinary impact. China is now the largest trade partner of many of the countries in the region. Huge investments, huge infrastructure building. The arrival of a big new player at a time of geostrategic uncertainty raises many questions, creates many opportunities, and we're going to explore some of that. So just a few figures to begin with. You know, between 2000 and 2013, trade between China and Latin America increased by 22 times. And by 2017, it was worth $266 billion, which is halfway towards the target that was announced by Xi Jinping in the inaugural CELAC China summit in Beijing in 2015. That target was to reach US $500 million by 2025. Now, this is clearly good news. It sounds like good news, and it is good news. But there are some things to understand about that trade. It's not balanced. 5 products, soya, copper, refined copper, iron ore, and oil accounted for 70% of those exports last year. It's also true that it's unevenly distributed geographically, and just a handful of countries, particularly with FDI, 80% of it is concentrated in mining and hydrocarbons, and a similar percentage in just 3 countries, Argentina, Brazil, and Peru. So it's important, but it's not entirely balanced, and it's not entirely straightforward. However, so far, so impressive. The big beast in the landscape globally these days is the Belt and Road Initiative, which we're also going to be talking about. This is a slightly shape-shifting initiative from Xi Jinping. It remains relatively undefined, but Latin America is now formally included in the discussions of Belt and Road, so we'll be asking what that entails. And I'm absolutely delighted to have the honor of chairing this panel of distinguished contributors. We have a terrific lineup for this discussion. On my immediate left, Roger Valencia, who is the Minister of Foreign Trade and Tourism in Peru. Roger's had more than 30 years of experience in the tourism sector, and after 2 years as Vice Minister, he became Minister of Foreign Trade and Tourism in April this year. And just beyond Roger, we have from Panama, we have Dulcidio de la Guardia, who is the former Minister of Economy and Finance of Panama. He stepped down recently to go back to the private sector and has served as Finance Director of the Grupo Morgan & Morgan. He was Vice Minister of Finance of Panama and Director for Corporate and Market Banking at HSBC, in many other roles. To Dulcidio's left, we have Tatiana Rosita, who's the China Chief Representative and General Manager for Business Development in Asia for the Brazilian petro giant Petrobras. Before that, she is a career diplomat. She is an economist, and she served in the embassy, in the Brazilian embassy in Beijing. She has served as in the Brazilian delegation to the United Nations, and she's a member of the Consultative Board of the China-Brazil Business Council. And beyond Tatiana, we have Kevin Gallagher, who is Professor of Global Development Policy at Boston University. Kevin has written many celebrated books which covering various aspects of China and Latin America relations, emerging markets, foreign direct investment, sustainability, and so on. He's one of the intellectual leaders in the analysis of the relationship with Latin America. And to his left, Alvaro Mendes from the London School of Economics, who is the co-founder of the LSE's Global South Unit, also a formidable academic in the field. He has a relationship with my old alma mater, Fudan University in Shanghai, but though I think it's probably changed since I was a student there, and has much experience again in the field. So onto our topic. I just wanted to begin by just reflecting briefly on this decade of China's increasing engagement in Latin America, and to ask each one of you, from your respective perspectives, what has been the impact of China's arrival in Latin America, a region where China had previously been a remarkably distant force and not a player. So,
okay.
What difference did it make?
What difference does it make? First of all, thank you very much, Isabel, and thank you, CAF, for having us here. Peru and China have a very long-term relationship. I don't know if everybody in the room is aware, but about 150 years ago, Chinese workers came to live in Peru. And in Peru, we have, Peruvian cuisine, which is today known in the world, has a strong influence of Chinese cuisine. And so that's a long time ago, 150 years. But even before that, already in the 17th century and early 18th century, Peru's copper, gold, and silver were going to China. And they were going to China through Manila. And Chinese products were coming from Manila to Mexico, part to Peru, part to Spain. The trade at that time was so important. Silk produced in China, brought by the galleon of Manila to Mexico, made the silk growers in Valencia, Spain, bankrupt in the early 18th century. By 1710, there was no more growers of producers of silk in Valencia. And so China has been part of the history. In recent years for Peru, China has invested a little over $10 billion in mining, in energy, in telecommunications, in construction projects. And it has created around 9,000 permanent jobs, which is an interesting part. And it did not come very easily. We were talking a minute ago about Shogun. Shogun Company was the first iron ore mining company that established itself in Peru almost 20 years ago. And we both learned from that establishment. It was in China, of course, being a much more vertical society, the role of unions and unions of workers is much less considered in the way you manage in the way you govern your investment. And in Peru, unions play a bigger role. So unions acted up as they are used in Peru. And Shogun Company, they don't know how to handle it. They have learned, and both have benefited from the learning. So for Peru, today China is the largest trade partner. And yes, you're right that the biggest export of Peru is copper, still, after 500 years. But our products, especially agricultural niche products, specialized products, are growing at double digits with China. This year, about close to 18%.
Right. Dulce.
I will say that well, China has been a significant trade partner with many countries in Latin America for many years. In the particular case of Panama, China has been the second largest user of the Panama Canal and the largest supplier of the Colón-free zone. So Panama has been dealing with China in trade terms for many years. However, it was not until recently, last year, when Panama decided to establish a diplomatic relationship with China, and basically, and that has jump-started the relationship between both countries. We are in the process of developing a common bilateral agenda, which focus on trade, tourism, investments, and we are trying to accomplish that through very high political dialogue between the Panamanian authorities and the Chinese authorities. So the relationship is moving extremely well. I think we have accomplished many things in over a year, and we see a bright future for both Panama and China relationship in the next couple of years, in the next few years, sorry.
Tatiana, again, another country where China is the largest trade partner.
That's it. Thank you very much. First, thank you also for CAF and Inter-American Dialogue, and it's a privilege to be here also among this very distinguished set of speakers. Sticking to your question about, what difference it has made right in this decade. I think I would go almost to the beginning, a decade now, the global financial crisis. China's role was, and with all the stimulus it gave to its economy, was fundamental also for the continuous growth in Brazil and in most part of Latin America and other emerging markets. That was a turning point. This was tremendously important for us to continue to have some space, policy space in Brazil. It's true that in hindsight we can say that it also created or aggravated some of the macroeconomic imbalances for China itself. And the country has been dealing with that more starkly since the adoption of the 13th multi-year plan. But so for Brazil and China, it has been a very, a crucial decade where China since 2009 is Brazil's largest destination market, is also our largest trade partner. Both for exports and imports. I would also emphasize that during this time, the relation has, especially since after 2010 and in the last 2-3 years, we can say that the relationship went from basically a trade relationship to an investment relationship, which requires, I think, much more also maturity from both sides. During this time, Brazil and China have also agreed to start a global partnership, a strategic partnership. We had a strategic partnership since 1993, and in 2012, it was elevated to a global strategic partnership, meaning we also have, a dialogue in regional and global affairs. So overall, I would say that today we are in, I think Brazil and China relationship are at its highest point, I think historically, I would say, politically, but also economically, where we find most dynamism overall, and it will be interesting to talk later more about also our challenges and opportunities.
Kevin, you've watched this process very closely.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, and thanks to the CAF and to the dialogue
all of you for coming. Well, your question is what's it been like over the past decade?
What's been the impact? What's the difference?
A decade ago was the Lehman Brothers crisis, and if it wasn't for China, Latin America would be in really bad shape right now. There'd be many more situations like Venezuela and Argentina if it wasn't for China. It used to be that when the United States got a cold, Latin America got the flu. Well, the United States 10 years ago today had a really bad flu, but most countries in Latin America just had a mild cold, and China really helped them get out of it. As you mentioned, Isabel, they're now #1 trading partner for South America and #2 for the region as a whole, and now they're big investors in the region, and it's been a real boon to economic growth. China clearly has a plan for Latin America. It's one of the most strategic places on the planet for it. To be provocative, I'll say that Latin America doesn't necessarily have a strategic plan for China, and it's of utmost importance for Latin America to put that together, especially now, given the fact that the Trump administration and the United States, one of the traditional rudders of economic growth for Latin America and the Caribbean, is pulling back its economic engagement in the region and across the world through the renegotiation of NAFTA and the trade war that we are engaging the entire world with. If you think about China's, really sees the region as strategic, it sees it as a key place for natural resources, sees it as a key place for investment to help some of its companies go abroad. It really hasn't globalized its companies as much as other countries have. And it sees it as a place to invest. Not only have they reached $260 billion worth of trade already, but they've pledged, as you said, $500 billion in trade and $250 billion in investment. And already China's national development banks, according to a database that my institute puts together with the dialogue, invests more in long-run development in Latin America than Latin America's own development banks, and the World Bank does almost every year on an annual basis. So this is, on many ways, this has been a big boon. It's ushered the best growth period in Latin America. If you look from 2003 till about 2016 or so, that's the best growth period that the region's experienced since the 1970s. And as Nora Lustig, who's going to be here tomorrow, has documented, many of the countries in the region took some of the premium and were able to erase some of the inequality and poverty that became so prevalent during the lost decades of the 80s and 90s. That said, it's accentuated the commodity-led growth in the region, which is the Achilles heel of long-run economic development in the region. And because of that kind of growth pattern, it's also endemic to social and environmental degradation, which has been on the uptick in the region throughout the period. And the Latin Americans really need to think about how to maximize those benefits. This is an incredible new growth pole for Latin America, but to mitigate those risks. And they really need to take the premiums from the new China relationship and invest it in industries and sectors of the future, invest it in institutions to help mitigate those social and environmental risks, and work with the Chinese as a region, not just in bilateral negotiations, but work with a region to think about ways to unclog their arteries in terms of infrastructure and help the region trade with each other and trade with Asia in general. I think the CAF actually would be a great forum for that. CELAC is what China has sort of chosen to be the chief intermediary for the region, which is an interesting organization, but it lacks the deep capacity and the long history in the region and the trust in the region and the capabilities to be able to convene and to really co-finance and come up with a collaborative way to think about the future.
Right. Alvaro.
Thank you very much, Isabel, and I think everything has been said, but I'll say a few things as well. First of all, thank you to President Carranza for the invitation, Michael Shifter, Giampiero Leoncini, Patricius Scaff. Isabel, it's a pleasure to be here with you, my co-panelists as well, and the audience, some of you who are experts on China and Latin America yourselves. So what has been the difference? I suppose I'd like to start by saying that it has changed the dynamics of our region. I'm Colombian. Always looking up to the US. Colombians call this respice polum, I think, which is Latin for look to the north. The arrival of China to the region could be called respice sinis, meaning look towards China. It has helped Latin America as a whole to see beyond the Atlantic and to focus on the Pacific like never before. It has helped the region to think about Asia as a place that is not as far away as we thought. If you ever have the chance to buy a map in China or to see a map from the Pacific perspective, you realize that Latin America is the window to Asia and vice versa, at least in the map. It has broken the monopoly of established multilateral development banks by introducing the idea of non-conditionality lending. I'm not so sure this is really the case. We'll debate this a little bit more later on. It has exposed our overly dependence on natural resources, which Kevin mentioned. It has also exposed our already existing vulnerabilities. We have weak foreign policy in general and a massive infrastructure deficit. We invest very little in research and development, and I think this is something that we knew all along, but I think it's more clear than ever, especially when we are just focusing on selling our commodities away. So I leave it at that. Thank you.
That's really interesting, and you know, it strikes me that we are, for many, many reasons, at a very interesting moment in the world. Some of those reasons are pretty terrible, and you know, we've talked about those in other fora, but. Tatiana, you talked about, or several of you mentioned the global financial crisis and the fact that China's intervention at that point, or China's growth at that point, saved Latin America from much worse consequences there might have been of that crisis. China itself put in a massive rescue package into its own economy, a multi-trillion-dollar package, which is coming home to roost a bit in China. And we also heard at in the opening session about the challenge of the end of the super cycle. So all of these things are beginning to come together as China itself is transitioning into another form of, or trying to transition into a new phase of its own economy, which will be less about sucking up natural resources, will be less about an infinitely growing demand for energy, coal, steel, all those things that have been the supplies that China has been most interested in around the world in the previous decades. Now, we've heard from several of you that Latin America has been the supplier of those goods, and that this is, you know, good for GDP, but it's not necessarily good for development. And I'd like just to explore that and how that might change. Kevin, you brought this up. Just tell us why that's not good.
Well, as I said, it's really been the Achilles heel of the region. When commodities prices are up, the economies grow. Some countries use some of that premium and reinvest and get a little bit of a growth spurt, but there's been real difficulty in generating long-run growth. GDP per capita since 1980 in the region has been just a little over 1% per year, largely because there hasn't been a diversity in trading partners and there hasn't been a diversity in the kinds of economic activity in the region. One of the great things about China is it brings diversity in trading partners. However, it's played a big role in sort of reconcentrating economic activity into those natural resource-based things. Now, China, I would disagree with you a little bit, even though China's economy is changing. Knock on wood, let's hope they don't have a financial crisis, because they did overshoot and do have their own massive debt problems. But we've calculated the consumption per capita of iron ore, copper, many of the core things, petroleum that the Chinese consume, and it's still at a much lower level than South Korea, Japan, and many other Asian countries. And so as China develops, there still will be a significant amount of demand for all of these great goods and services that Latin Americans have, which is an opportunity if they finally take the proceeds and invest in long-run research and development, innovation, people, and institutions, such that the environmental impacts aren't so harsh, and the benefits of that growth are more inclusive.
I agreeing in what you say, where you invest. I like to tell the story that many of you know is Peru. In the last 20 years, Peru decided that it could not be an autarkic economy, a closed economy, decided to open its markets, signed 19 free trade agreements, and in Latin America, only 2 countries, in South America, only 2 countries have free trade agreement with China, and that's Chile and Peru. And I think Panama is negotiating one, but a free trade agreement actually is not to trade copper or gold. commodities are traded on a broader market, and the price of them depends actually on demand and on many other subjects than the free trade agreement. The free trade agreement is to trade in other value-added products and into investment, into capitals, and into people as well. So that's the interesting part. Many Latin American countries have already gone into the step of constructing the world we want to see. And it's the world in which the most important players of international relationships 300 years ago were families. For 300 years there have been states, but after states there are multinational institutions and free trade agreements or agreements of different sorts. So there are those documents that we produce that create instruments for the type of world that we're shaping. And in that sense, not only Pacific Alliance, which we are there with Colombia in Mexico and Chile, but also CPTPP and other forms of treaties construct the world. And China has been very important into maintaining free trade with the world, right, in the last few years. So in that sense, yes, multilateralism is very important, open markets, and look at Australia, who's now candidate candidate to associate state to the Pacific Alliance, is a country that went from being a producer of commodities, minerals and wool and so on, to producer of know-how. And transition was done from the 80s to today. So it's a very important path, and it's a way of seeing the world. And where does the money come from? From your trade and from the possibility of the other countries also growing their consumption levels. And so China has 400 million citizens of the world, they say, and it has another 900 million people who are still to come to the market, and so as well as India. So in that sense, Latin America has a bigger share of its population already in the world's market, but we still have Peru particularly, we still have 1/5, so 20% of our population below the line of poverty. And so we have to get investment, we have to get infrastructure, but we have to get also the world in which we can contribute to.
I want to come back to the infrastructure, but I'd like to pick you up slightly on on your statement that China's been the big defender of free trade, because there is another view of China's trading practice, which is that, yes, it's a lot of trade, but it's essentially a mercantilist pattern of trade, which in some ways fits with what Alvaro and Kevin have been saying about, taking in raw materials and exporting manufactured goods, low-cost manufactured goods. Now, that's not necessarily an entirely beneficial to other emerging economies, because it makes it harder to protect and develop.
It depends if you have which kind of instrument are you using to trade. If you don't have if you have a bilateral instrument, let's see what this says. If you have a free trade agreement, then let's see which other things are being traded, which are the access levels that the free trade agreement talks about. And in that sense, yes, I mean, if you are only selling commodities in the world and you don't let many of your products to come, well, or if you have a protectionist market, then you'll see what you want to protect. We had this conversation just not long ago with Colombia, and we said, we have to be where our agreement says we have to be. But the most important thing is that these are constructions that we make. So countries decide what is their position in the world in terms of how are they going to contribute to the world's economy. And when you think on how you're going to contribute to the world economy, you either decide to be a protectionist country, or you decide to be an open country. And in the case of Peru, Peru decided to become an open country because it has something, because we learned that it's very beneficial for us to buy from America, to buy from other countries, at the same time that we can sell to those countries.
So Alvaro, Colombia's been mentioned. You know, for much of its recent history, indeed, China has maintained very strong barriers in terms of trade and investment. Is that an option that it allows its trading partners to maintain? Colombia, for example, you're in some ways at the beginning of your relationship with China. Is that a concern in Colombia?
I think so. I mean, Colombia still looks to Washington more than any other country in South America. Respice polum still guides Colombian policy. The Pacific, in many ways, has been abandoned. Going back a little bit to what the minister was saying, I think one of the problems that we see, I agree with you, that it's not all about commodities, and free trade is very important. And I think the focus has been in the region to have free trade agreements, and we have Chile, Peru, Costa Rica, and soon to come Panama, possibly in the next 5, 6, 7 months. But what I think the emphasis needs to change a little bit, because free trade agreements allow you to trade without tariffs. But what you need to incentivize is better infrastructure, because the cost of transportation in the region are 3 times higher than in many other countries, like, for example, OECD countries. That this is according to the OECD. And one of the main issues in the region is that the infrastructure is so inadequate. More than 60% of the roads are unpaved, compared to 46% in emerging economies in Asia and 17% in Europe. Latin America spends a smaller GDP on infrastructure than any other region in the world, except sub-Saharan Africa. At present, the region only spends 2.3% of GDP on infrastructure, which is extremely low. Experts agree that to bridge that gap, you need to invest at least 6.2% of GDP annually. Now, there's some good news. The latest figures from 2015 suggest that some countries are temporarily reaching that target, notably Bolivia at 8.42, Peru at 6.89, and Colombia at 6.45. But the regional average is still very low, and in my opinion, I think this represents a threat to the region prospects for development. So to get there, to break the dependency on commodities, you need to invest on this. And of course, that means investing in roads, railways, ports, and urban transport to make sure that the speed and the advantage of this is there. For example, to move sugar from Jujuy in Argentina, I don't know, I think we have some Argentinians here, to Buenos Aires by rail, a journey of only 1,000 miles takes 22 days. The same amount of time that it takes you to take the same sugar to Germany. Can you believe that? Cargo can be take up to 2 days from Bogota to Santa Marta, and this is the most developed area in the region, plus another 2 days of customs. So this is something that countries need to address properly.
Tatiana.
Yeah, thank you, Isabel. I think I have a somewhat different perspective. I think I wouldn't blame China for the pattern of production export we have. This has been like that throughout history. So, I mean, with other countries before, right? So that's how we got here, and there has been some very specific development, structural development in the region. But I think we cannot really, blame China for our own weaknesses. Mm-hmm. So I think China, although it makes us, I think it is pretty much like a magnifier, actually, because the scale is so big, the impact is so huge of what happens with China. It makes us see better, or it accelerates and aggravates many problems. So this is the case with the so-called, commoditization again, or deindustrialization. So it just highlights that we have to take our development in our own hands.
So is it accelerating the solutions, or just
we should accelerate solutions? We should actually take these opportunities. For example, if you look into Brazil, largely because of China, we don't have a current account problem these days, which is very positive when you see a lot of volatility. Right. So this is something that we could also take into account. This is something that changed completely from previous years and from previous crisis in the 90s. But I do think, as our other panelists mentioned, yes, this is something that we have. It just reinforces that this pattern of production, and especially for large economies, is not the best one in the long run. So I think China actually gives us many times the opportunity to look into these problems. And when we face the Chinese model and all the coordination, the synchronization of trade, investment, technological policies, it makes us think that we should have some of that. Not in the sense of, I'm not talking about interventionist policies, or I'm just talking about the role of the state in terms of providing not only the basic resources in terms of education, health, security, and, but also in terms of planning and coordination. I think this is something that it would be good for countries like Brazil to have a better coordination to deal with China. And it would also be good for Latin America that we have a better coordinated action, coordinated planning and action to deal with China, because that's the way, although we could always point that it seems to be a very complete coordination in Chinese government institutions. Of course, you'll find different views, but yes, mostly they would act as one force and coordinated. And this is something that I think we should take as a fact to improve our coordination, not as a model, because it would be very difficult to replicate such model, and I don't think that's what that's to be replicated by countries in the region, by democratic countries. But it's certainly, we have to look into that, and especially now that with the infrastructure issues, as Alvaro mentioned, clearly to me, the lack of coordination, I'm talking both nationally in terms in my country, but also in the region, the lack of coordination makes us lose opportunities for having more cooperation with China for example, regional integration in electricity, roads, railways, transportation. I think it's something we have been discussing for a long time, but we are not there in the right model yet. And certainly organisms like CAF and other regional banks can be very, including the ADB, where China is already a member.
So what I'm hearing loud and clear is that infrastructure is the enormous need in the whole region, which again, luckily Belt and Road comes along. You have China at a moment in China's own economic cycle where it's looking for new markets. It's looking for, it has a lot of surplus capacity that it wants to deploy around the world, including in Latin America. But what I'm also hearing are some doubts about whether the region itself is equipped to take best advantage of this. Belt and Road is a kind of vast, comprehensive sketch map, really, at this point, with a lot of projects which accrue under it, some of which were announced before Belt and Road was. So, it's still a slightly shape-shifting notion. But if you're going to have infrastructure development in the region, then regional coordination, as Tatiana has just said, would seem to be a fairly key element that would allow the region to take advantage of it best. Now, Kevin mentioned that CELAC isn't the best forum for this. Is there another forum? Is there another? What can the countries in the region do at this point to sort of step up their coordination and ensure that what is developed is of comprehensive benefit?
I will say first, going back to Kevin, that first, the countries need to have a clear strategy on how to deal with China.
Pardon?
Each country has to have a clear strategy in terms of how to deal with China. In the case of Panama, we decided, after establishing relationship with China, that we set up a China cabinet, and we met we met twice a month, basically to discuss the strategic objective of what do we want to get from the relationship. We joined the One Belt, One Road initiative. We are negotiating the free trade, but we were very clear that we wanted China to use the logistic platform of Panama to distribute Chinese goods throughout Latin America.
And maybe not build another canal in Nicaragua.
We could have a discussion where that is feasible or not, but
just a thought.
And of course, that could be also an issue. But I think that countries need to have a clear strategy how to deal with China and what they want to get out from the relationship. Secondly, you need to have a consensus within the society. And third, I think regional interaction or regional integration or cooperation, of course, will have a significant impact in improving the relationship of the region with China. But first, each country needs to go back and decide what do they want to get from the relationship. So we also want, I think, all Latin American countries want to bring into our region the massive expertise of Chinese companies, in particular in the development of infrastructure. Now they have in China actually an overcapacity in that sector, and they have tremendous experience building transmission lines, power grids, and the energy sector, roads, trains, and we want to bring that expertise. Also, we want to bring financing. I do have to basically say that if you are an investment rated country, probably you don't have issues on getting access to capital markets, just like Panama. We can get all the financing we want at very competitive terms and long-term terms. This is a warning. I think for the countries in Latin America, the countries should separate the financing decision of a project from the contractor of a project. So basically, don't mix up the decision, because probably you are not going to get the best solution if you mix the financing with the contractor.
But that is one of the characteristics of Chinese projects and Chinese finance.
That is one of the characteristics, yes. I'm basically telling a warning to the Latin American countries. Try not to do it, because then you're not going to get the best financing, and you're not going to get the best contractor or the best project available.
Right. Well, that's a warning. I mean, if you look at Chinese finance, the Chinese say that their finance comes without the strings and conditions that other lenders insist on. Many countries have welcomed that. It hasn't been an entirely happy story, however. I mean, if you look at China's debt to Venezuela or Ecuador, and the structures of those loans turned out not to be very helpful, given the fluctuation in oil prices. Or in Pakistan, for example, where the chairman of the central bank said that he didn't know the conditions of Chinese lending. Chairman of the central bank didn't know. This doesn't look too good. Or in Sri Lanka with Hambantota, where Sri Lanka took on a massive debt for a port which delivered very little revenue and ended up in Chinese hands for 90 years as an extraterritorial operation.
Yeah, but let me say something there. I mean,
but these are cautionary tales. I'm just wondering if there are lessons in the region from these cautionary tales.
I would like to comment one thing. I'm not going to comment on the policy of the Chinese, because they are the ones who have to explain that. But I will comment if somebody is chairing the central bank of a country and does not know the terms of the contract he's signing, well, then
but he didn't sign it.
I would say, or somebody for him sign it, right? So I would go back to Tatiana's comment. We shall not blame our own deficiencies on China's shoulders. I mean, if the problem is with the country signing or accepting whoever goes to a bank and gets a loan and doesn't know the terms. I mean, whether it's a country or an individual.
But I guess I guess the point that I'm raising is that there is a responsibility on both sides. That a lender, it would normally be expected to behave responsibly. If a bank lends you money you can't repay, it's the bank's problem as much as your problem, and the bank's responsibility also.
Well, that's what happened. That's what provoked the tremendous crisis all over, all over Europe and the U.S. It was called junk bonds, and of course it's not only the bank's problem; it's the problem of the regulators. I mean, if you have a regulation that allows that to happen, then all of a sudden everybody has to pay for that, and the world knows that. So I think we've gone through that. And that's why I was mentioning what is the trade agreement you've signed. What are the conditions of your trade agreement? What does it mean when you sign, free trade of capitals? In the case of Peru, any of these documents has to be public and has to be printed. To be enacted, has to be in the official journal of the country and download it anytime you want from the website.
Okay, that's not the case in every country in Latin America.
I must say I don't know what's the case in other countries, but in the case of Peru, today the Peruvian president is challenging the country to do a major change. Everybody talks about second generation reforms, as a better state. Well, better state is not only the executive, of course, it's the legislative, of course, is the judiciary. And the president of Peru is challenging the judiciary because we knew that it was deficient in many ways. So challenge that, but that's homework. When you talk to another country, get your things ready.
Kevin, you've been trying to come in.
Well, first, I want to underscore what you and Tatiana have said. Don't blame Latin America's problems on the Chinese. It's been an incredible opportunity, but it just hasn't been managed as well. It's the gringos that are blaming all their problems on China, and we've got this huge trade war, which is going to drag the world economy down. On the policy conditionality, China needs to take a next step on that. China should be applauded for not having policy conditionality. Right, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund put policy conditionalities on loans in the 1980s and 1990s in Latin America, saying, we'll give you this loan for this particular project if you privatize industries far, far away from this particular project. And that put a real drag on growth in the region. It was too quick of a liberalization and a shift of economic model, and it really brought 2 decades of anemic growth to Latin America. So that we'll give China a plus for. But what China needs to get a little bit more clear on is the difference between policy conditionality and portfolio and project level due diligence, right? You have to look at what the impact of your loan portfolio is going to be on a particular country and its debt sustainability. And they obviously have gone way too far in Venezuela, way too far in Pakistan, Djibouti, and Sri Lanka. They need to get a little bit sharper on the risk assessment related to the debt sustainability of their projects. And that's different than policy conditionality, right? That's real risk assessment. Secondly, on environment and social impacts, when often in the region, the Latin American countries are offering up projects that the CAF has already said no to, that the Inter-American Development Bank has already said no to, because they didn't pass due diligence on the social and environmental impacts. The big, huge dam in Ecuador was rejected by IDB in 1992. There's almost every single project that the Chinese have financed in the in the Andean Amazon has already been rejected by somebody else on social and environmental grounds. And then, therefore, it's no surprise that these loans that are supposed to be 5 years, $3 billion, haven't even gotten off the ground yet because they're nests of social and environmental protests because the due diligence hasn't been done. So it's really important to get this clearer that doing an environmental impact assessment of a project to make sure that the engineering specifications are actually going to be able to get enough water to be able to generate the electricity in a way that isn't going to cause a major blow up that causes 25,000 people to have to be moved like happened this summer in Ecuador is project level due diligence. It's not imposing environmental regulations on a country that actually has higher regulations than China does at home.
Right. Aldo, were you trying to?
Speaking of due diligence, I think perhaps I would like to talk briefly about the AIB in this case, which is bound to have more due diligence. It doesn't mean that they will. Oftentimes they relegate that to...
It's promised.
The promise, at least in paper. But this could be a source that would be very important for the region because it could provide the co-financing that is needed for many of the infrastructure gaps that we have in the region. And I'm referring to the bank is in Spanish called BAI, which is Banco Asiático de Inversión en Infraestructura, or AIB. And for them, cross-connectivity is crucial, sustainability is crucial as a priority in order to approve projects, and they are deeply interested in the Latin American region. And the region seems to be interested in the AIB, and I said, quote unquote, seems to be interested because while the AIB has made it clear, they came to the region in March, Chile and Argentina, invited by the IDB to express and to make sure that Latin American countries understood that they were there to offer help if they complete their membership, because they will be able to provide the co-financing that is not able to be provided entirely by the IDB or CAF perhaps alone, but they are currently not full members of the region in the AIB, and that's a problem because there are 7 countries that have been accepted to be prospective members, which is a category that the Chinese had to inflate how big their bank was initially. So they accepted these 7 countries, which are on the website, prospective members, and but we're pending for the capital transfers of their subscriptions, and that includes Brazil, Peru, Venezuela, Bolivia, Chile, Argentina, and Ecuador, all in chronological order. The participation will be very modest. It will be around half of what Canada is already is in the bank, around $414 million. It's not that much, but what will this give these countries is the opportunity to have access to financing in the region and the co-financing that is very important. And Latin Americans were very proactive at getting these invitations. I think we love to be part of the club, taking the picture. I'm not so sure we are very good at completing things, and I speak that as a Latin American. Last year they have the 2nd annual meeting in Korea, and the Peruvians didn't go. The Chinese were not very happy. This year Peru went to the meeting, which took place in India, but Chile, Bolivia, and Ecuador were missing. Of all countries, Venezuela had 7 people attending the meeting. I think none of them really knew what they were doing there, to be frank with you. But interestingly, it's an exaggeration, but I think something has to be done in terms of coordination. You talk about coordination. We talk about perhaps cooperation. I think I like the word cooperation a little bit more to understand that these projects will benefit cross-country connectivity that will eventually benefit the region. CELAC wasn't successful. I think the Chinese took that in a way of mirroring what they did in Africa with FOCAC. I think CELAC is clear now. Perhaps it's not the way forward. These sort of forums have to be taken into a more perhaps deeper debate, and perhaps with more participation from all the different countries in the region.
It's interesting that you bring up AIB because it's a very interesting initiative from China, first multilateral development bank and so on. It's relatively small still. Most of the lending comes from the policy banks and other Chinese banks, and has made, those banks have not made the commitments that AIIB has made to international standards. Do you think that eventually AIIB could influence those banks in that direction, or that Chinese lending practices of the kind that Kevin was complaining about, where projects which have been rejected for very sound reasons are financed and implemented by Chinese partners, or they begin to be implemented by Chinese partners, where that doesn't happen?
I think it will happen. I think so far the AIB has been a little bit lazy, with all due respect, leaving their partners to do the due diligence. Yeah. They have to invest more on that. But I think they're bound to do it because they advertise that so much. They also have very important membership from European countries. And the British and the French, in a way to save face, have to push in that direction. I suspect that's one of the reasons why Latin American countries have revisited that initial invitation that came from Beijing and think, this is basically another little World Bank. Is it worth completing this membership? And I think that's perhaps one of the issues that we have to take into account. Beijing is not necessarily very happy with the AIB direction because in many ways they realize it's in a way out of their hands to a certain extent. But the AIB is fundamentally important, and there are 64 countries who are full members, and they will represent very important elements in terms of financing. And there is a country in Africa, Egypt, that already has a loan from the AIB, which demonstrates that this would be outside the region, not just for Asia. In fact, there are 3 African countries who are already full members: Ethiopia, Egypt, and Madagascar, while Latin America is still lagging behind.
I mean, it's clearly a key initiative, and there are tensions about the governance of AIIB and whether those promises, whether actually the staffing and the infrastructure exists in the AIIB to meet the standards to which it has been committed. And I think there is an open question about learning here, actually. And, we tend to think China's this, great super state, they know everything. But actually, in terms of risk assessment, in terms of the kind of engagement and mistakes that Shogang made when they first went abroad, in terms of the experience of operating abroad, a Chinese state-owned enterprise is not where you learn those things. You have a very privileged environment in China. You can basically call the party secretary and get obstacles removed. When these state-owned enterprises began to operate abroad, it was kind of a bit of a shock. And I wonder, Tatiana, you've seen this from both sides, whether in terms of project risk assessment and investment decisions, whether there's still a lot of learning to be done on the Chinese side.
Oh, absolutely.
Certainly.
Yeah, absolutely. I think. So one thing is the Chinese side and the issues that also Kevin was mentioning. But we have to understand that this is very new, right? We are talking about the going out policy starting in 2000, and coming from the Chinese coming from the opening up, the reform and opening up has 40 years. So and see the tremendous changes that have happened in these 40 years in a totally different regime. I think this also gives us the opportunity of thinking about the big picture and what about those financial institutions mean, these new financial institutions. It was unthinkable, I mean, even in the 90s to think about that. I think, well, there were talks about already Asian Monetary Bank at that time, but nothing like we have now. So this has happened really fast. And in a way, it also shows us that things haven't really gone where most of, at least the Western world thought in the early 90s, right? And then after China's accession to the WTO. So we thought there would be some convergence. There is some convergence. There is a lot of convergence in terms of, I think, opening up and tariffs. You can always see like the glass half empty or half, but of course there is a tremendous transformation and opening in China. There remains significant barriers to, especially to investment. Also, a very opaque environment, a different environment to work with, but it has really opened up. Now, for what we see now is this sort of a new system. These seeds that are actually growing up from this sort of transition, this or new world order, something that we're living as we speak. So, of course, it's very difficult for us to really. So. But and that said, when you talk, so this is from this more long-term view, political view. Now, from the corporate and side, we can on the corporate side we can see that by the different tales we have from investors. For example, in my country, you see that, well, there has been a lot of investment, not good due diligence, and sometimes it takes like the central government to say, no, now stop, right? This is like what happened since 2013, 14, 15, a lot of legislation in China for facilitation of investment abroad. And then end of 16, 17, there were excesses. So now let's have a look at that, and that's what happened. So messages all through the country that they should, and this is sort of a way, also the Chinese way of dealing with this learning, that is learning from society for this new world. And we see, for example, in Brazil, cases where we know that there have been, even with major corporations, listed corporations, that you have bad investments, but you have very good investments too. And I also think that the Chinese are very happy. Thank you for the loans that they are giving to most of Latin America, actually, if you compare also to other regions and other cases. So there may be extreme cases like in our region, like in Venezuela, but it's a whole sort of different conditions. But mostly, I would say it's a place where even it could be seen as I've heard from Chinese officials in state-owned banks, also in policy banks, like this is an interesting also springboard for them to learn Western rules, but yet being in an environment of developing countries where we still also see the world in a similar way, right? We cannot forget that China's second world power, but still developing country.
Yes, and I would like to add something of my own experience. Before China was accepted to the World Trade Organization, there was a visit of the chairman of the Communist Party and the Secretary of Commerce to different countries of Latin America to ask for the vote of the countries in favor of China becoming member. I don't know if you remember that event, but then when he was traveling in Peru, he explained to us, he said to us, the Americans, he said, particularly Madeleine Albright, with name, he said that. He said, particularly her, are very insistent in property rights, intellectual property. And I explained it, he said, I explained it to her, that when I was a kid, we didn't own our pants. So property is a concept. It's a concept in different societies, and property is a concept that today in the world, individual property is understood as part of property of European tradition, in which you have 300 years, 400 years of individual property, if not more. And when I was a kid, he said, we didn't own our pants. So this was just to illustrate where China was coming from in his own generation, right? So we asked him, I said, sir, okay, understood that, but we also know that China is a millennial culture. And during the times of Admiral Wu, Chinese were issuing letters of credit. If a letter of credit is not intellectual property, what is it? And so he said, oh no, I hate historians. This is China. I mean, we all have to learn from both sides. We have to understand how they think. And we also, I mean, Peru, we also are a millennial culture. So we have to understand how the world thinks, but not in terms of, not in short time terms. We have to understand what is our contribution in long term, as well as being practical today. You know? I mean, for Peru, I can understand the complexity embedded into every investment, right? The mining investment or energy investment and where you're investing and so. But besides that, I mean, the big picture is there is a big market over there. In Peru, we have about 4 million workers in agriculture. And if those 4 million only feed 30 million Peruvians, that means that every farmer has only 9 tummies to fill. That means poverty. If we expand that market, if we go to the average of the world, which is every farmer feeds about 170 people, which is Argentina or a little bit more in the US, then all of a sudden you have a booming agricultural sector. And with that, we think, let's sell avocados in the US. And it's a very basic concept, but that's how we think about our relationship with that big market that's China.
Right. Dulcidio, you mentioned earlier the dangers of mixing finance and projects, that essentially they had to be separate. Back in April, all the European Union ambassadors but one, the exception being Hungary, signed a report which had various concerns about Belt and Road and how it was operating. There were lots of concerns which were specific to the European Union. But one of the things that was a worry to them was the fact that 89% of the Belt and Road projects had gone to Chinese companies. So, as a kind of win-win proposition, this is a little skewed. And that was largely because the finance, was tied to Chinese companies. So how can Latin America avoid this?
Well, first, I think you have to separate the countries in Latin America, the ones with access to capital markets and the ones without. For the ones without, it's going to be a very difficult decision, or very difficult to separate the financing from the project itself. And at the end, the country will have to decide whether the project is needed so much that they are willing to bundle the financing with the contractor. For countries with access to capital markets, then the decision is very clear. You need to separate the decision. The financing, you can have access to financing at long-term financing at good rates, and then you choose the project and the contractor based on the best offer from the market. So in the case of Panama, it's an easy decision to make. We have access to capital markets. For other countries, it's difficult. It's a difficult one. So there's no clear answer, and I think every country has to choose the path to follow.
So Dulcidio's laid out this ideal scenario. So what are the chances here, Kevin?
Well, going back to my original remarks, this is where strategy comes in. It's actually not true that in every case the Chinese are requiring their locals. Correct me if I'm wrong, but in a lot of the investments in Petrobras, there's hardly any Chinese involved, whereas in a lot of the oil concessions in Ecuador there are, and a lot of that's because in Brazil there's all sorts of engineers that know a lot about oil and so forth, and in Ecuador there aren't, and Brazil can sometimes bargain better. And what I'm saying for the region, what a lot of folks are saying about the region, is that collectively they have an incredible strategic amount of bargaining power because they have location-specific assets that China needs. Can't get the copper hardly anywhere else besides Peru and Chile. Iron ore, Peru, Brazil, the soybeans, Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, Bolivia, and so forth. If there's a regional strategy, then you have more bargaining power as a collective group. And so far that really hasn't been maximized. I don't want to give the implication that I said to get rid of SELAC. They're really important. That's sort of the arms of all the State Departments, but it needs more of a partnership. During the Free Trade Area of the Americas negotiations, it was the IDB, the CEPAL, and the OAS, right? That's not the right kind of tripartite partnership for China-Latin America relationships because it has the United States involved. But if something like CEPAL with the CAF and SELAC could be more of a sharing of partnerships where different parts of those bodies have different kinds of expertise. With the CAF, with the financing, the SELEC with the foreign relations, and CEPAL with more of the longer run development kind of aspects. And convening power and trust that's opened up to the business community and civil society organizations. That's going to give you a lot of forum and a lot of bargaining power. And I would wager, like Tatiana said, if there was an actual regional infrastructure plan or a regional grid proposal or a package set of distributed energy for the region, that the region said finance this part, and this part, the Chinese are more than willing to negotiate, because their strategy in terms of financing is not just returns on investment in particular projects, right? Because they're trying to get their companies to learn how to be global. They're trying to diversify their foreign exchange holdings, and so they're willing to take more risks and be more long-term. And I just don't see many countries in the region as a whole taking full advantage of it. And you really can, because you can't get the copper anywhere else.
Tatiana, are people really kind of parlaying their strengths or failing to?
Just a quick remark. We had a meeting in Mexico not long ago, and that's the Pacific Alliance meeting. But there was something very interesting on that Pacific Alliance meeting. Mercosur was present. And so Mercosur, with 2 presidents and 2 ministers, was present. We had a first talk between Pacific Alliance and Mercosur in terms of infrastructure needed and some of the global views. So maybe that's the space, but please.
Encouraging steps.
In terms of this, I agree completely with Dulcidio about it's something we have been discussing a lot in Brazil, including in the Brazilian Center for International Relations, where I coordinate a group, it has been many years since we feel this need for really to have a clearer strategy on China. And I'm very happy to learn that also you have this cabinet group. It's very interesting. But I think it's very difficult for long-term projects, large infrastructure projects, for you to dissociate completely the contractor with the financing. I mean, usually I would see in all the, if you have bids and all the consortiums that would come, usually they would come with some association with finance, and that's the way it has always happened to different Exim banks around the world, and also credit insurance agencies. But we could try to mitigate certain risks, and for example having different associations with local companies, or not only a Chinese project, but a cooperation, like the regional cooperation project, for example. I think.
And excuse me, but doesn't competitive bidding, doesn't open, transparent, and competitive bidding address some of?
Yeah, I'm getting to this part.
Sorry.
So that's why the Chinese haven't really been building a lot of infrastructure, for example, in Brazil. It just hasn't happened. They have been buying a lot of companies, mostly through merger and acquisitions, mostly through acquisitions. So today they have very sizable investments in the Brazilian electric sector. Mostly, so about over 80% of Chinese, about the 55 billion more or less of Chinese investments in Brazil would be in the energy sector, including electric sector, also oil and gas, some mining. But it's not, again, a Chinese fault, because we have to have very, clear rules, mitigating long-term risks. This is something that we have been struggling with for many years. We have improved somewhat in some areas in the last few years, but still there are lots of issues, even regulatory issues, for example, in railways, in roads. We have some improvements, mostly in ports, and where you have more open environment, you would see the Chinese coming. For example, in ports, they have made some important investments. In electric sector, although we even had some regulatory issues in this sector, but they have been very strong. Why? Because Chinese companies see a real advantage to them. You wouldn't have such a vast country where they could apply their technology, some of the technology as ultra high voltage as Brazil. So this is an interesting case, and the electric companies there are for now very strong. But so we have to dissociate between investments also and financing. So for example, in the case of actually in the oil sector, at least with the state-owned company Petrobras, there really only recently there have been some joint investments in the biddings, but actually most, so this in the last 5 years, but mostly we're talking about financing, not really investments. But and going to the Belt and Road, we see also that over 60 to 70% of actually resources. We are also talking about financing mostly, not investment. So this is something that we have to work on. I think a good, maybe an interesting way out is for us to work in cooperation, as Alfredo mentioned, having more actors on board. And also, one last comment about this, the financing, different financing mechanisms and funds that the Chinese have created, especially for Latin America. For example, the Industrial Cooperation Fund, the CLI Fund, the Latin American Cooperation Fund, the CLAC Fund. They have actually hardly disbursed, any loans. Why? My take is that they're in a learning process. So they are actually funds to to cooperate and invest in the region, to increase economic cooperation. But they were also funds from the Chinese point of view, the regulators and the finance, they were like investments for Chinese reserves. So they want high returns on that. But it's very difficult to have, in the high returns short term if you want to invest in infrastructure. So you need to have a longer, so I think this will need to be adjusted. And also the bureaucracies has been formed. They were not, most of the bureaucracy in this, they were not exposed to foreign countries or to projects. Mm-hmm. So it's something that I think we should build together.
That's that learning, yes, that we were talking about. I want to move on to another issue. I was very struck 5 years ago, the Atlantic Council published a report on, which is entitled something like US-China Cooperation, the Key to the Global Future, which makes you think what a long time 5 years can be. We have seen a bit of a breakdown in that cooperation, threatened trade wars. Latin America is a region traditionally, or at least in relatively recent history, very much in the US camp. We're living through this extraordinary US presidency in which old alliances are apparently not as valued as they were, in which is having extraordinary destabilizing effects around the world. But this region, Latin America, is in the eye of the storm, if you like, that you have, if there is really to be a confrontation between the US and China, what difficulties does that create for Latin America? We've seen this extraordinary episode with Salvador switching its diplomatic recognition to the PRC from Taiwan, and a slightly bizarre reaction, frankly, from the United States to that. Darcidio, you switched relatively recently from Taiwan to the PRC. Presumably felt well rewarded for that. But if this is a pattern now in global politics, what are the impacts on Latin America, given your relationship with China, the investment from China, the traditional relationship with the United States, the continuing importance of the United States in the region. How is that going to play out, do we think?
First, I think this is a reality. I mean, the U.S. has been basically withdrawing, I will say, for the last 10 years from the region. Basically, they focus their, in particular with Central America, they focus their relationship on basically security in terms of immigration and the fight on drugs. Okay. So, but the rest of the issues are not at the forefront of the bilateral dialogue between the U.S. and Central America. And with this administration, these issues have been basically exacerbated. So there is a vacuum. And China basically is filling that vacuum left by the U.S. They have the means, they have overcapacity, they have the savings, and they are looking for Latin America to be a strategic place to invest, basically to get some of the raw materials and the ability to invest. The Latin American countries now face a very difficult path ahead. In terms of course, you need to maintain a healthy relationship with the U.S., but at the same time, you want to develop a stronger ties with China. It looks like here in the U.S., the China issues, in particular with Latin America, is becoming a big concern for U.S. policy. So what I see moving forward is a very rough, very difficult path for Latin American countries when they try to improve or strengthen their relationships with China. And we're going to get probably a harsh response from Washington on this subject. Look, the best example is what's happening with El Salvador. So we'll see. I mean, it's going to be a very difficult, stormy.
I see it as interesting times. They're all, but also opportunities.
When Rex Tillerson warns you about the dangers of snuggling up to China, do you pay any attention?
Oh, I would say okay. I mean, what does it mean snuggling up? Peru.
I don't think that was his
Peru.
phrase.
Yeah, Peru has a free trade agreement with China, with Japan, with Korea. And we're negotiating one with Vietnam, with Brunei, with Dar es Salaam.
So that's a no. You say you pay no attention to.
No, we actually have a very interesting trade balance with the U.S. It is in favor of the U.S. by about 1.4 billion every year.
Yeah.
So and that's what it is. We buy more than what we sell. Thank you very much. Right. I mean, our consumers benefit from that. So we're not going to go and say we need to balance the trade and you need to buy more. No, we think that's part of the business. It's completely the opposite with China. We actually, they buy us more than what we sell. We also are happy with that. Don't think that we want to balance that too. So I think it's case by case, it's free trade agreements, it's more the instruments you build. And the reason why I was mentioning, the free trade agreement with Japan and Korea and so is because for Peru, Asia has been continuously a trading partner. We have a China embassy in Peru since the 70s. So 1970s is when Peru officially opened its trade, when not even the States was open. I remember the ping pong diplomacy?
Yeah, 71.
Yeah, we already had an embassy then.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Álvaro, you were...
I think the geopolitical element has been there for some time. I mean, going back to Panama, the U.S. had concerns when 1997 came and Hutchinson Whampoa took over the ports. So this is a concern that has been going on for some time. They were very silent on the Panamanian switching to the Popular Republic of China from Taiwan. They were silent on the Dominican Republic, and now I think this is a political strategy by Trump. I don't think he really knows what he's doing in terms of making a statement. Actually, Obama was more strategic about fencing China off with his own initiative in the region, in India, and then with the TPP as well, which is one of the first things that Trump got rid of when he came to office. So I think the geopolitical element is there. Obviously, China has the advantage of not having any dirty laundry in the region whatsoever so far, but I think it's an important issue to consider. And of course, the U.S. has this long history with the region, and of course will be used for political reasons as much as we want. But I think it's a consideration that has to be taken into account, definitely.
Well, when then Secretary of State Rex Tillerson said much the same thing in Africa, African countries said, fine, but what are you bringing to the party, to the United States? And do you think there's any prospect that China's expansion in what was the U.S. backyard will stimulate the U.S. to take more interest again in the region, or is this just a withdrawal from global engagement that we're seeing?
One would hope. I mean, if you talk to people in the State Department, the Western Hemisphere affairs, they probably want to do that, but they always felt that they have been neglected in every single administration. I mean, this is not, the neglect to the region didn't come with Trump, by the way. Yeah. This has been happening for decades. Mm-hmm. So we cannot just simply blame Trump for the neglect to the region, which has happened in the past as well. Interestingly, Trump has had an interesting impact in the region, which is a unifying effect. Somehow we feel more alike Latinos because the fact that Trump is going after the Hispanic Americans in many ways. So, but I think the problem has been there for a long time.
Kevin, you've written about this triangle many times.
The worst case is an absolute disaster. There's some interest in the United States that would love to see a new Cold War with China, and I hope they're on the losing side of these debates. The two countries are 40% of the world economy, more than 60% of world trade, and so if there is a massive trade war or some security concern, we're all in trouble economically, especially the United States. The GAO estimates that we're going to have $1 trillion in debt, and we borrow close to, we're buying hundreds of millions of dollars from the Chinese every single day. But on the positive end, there's been a couple positive things that could play in. I'd wager that if it wasn't for all this Chinese finance, you would have never have seen a $5 billion capital increase at the World Bank and the IFC last year. There's also a bill moving through Congress called the BUILD Act that would consolidate a number of the credit granting agencies in the United States and create our own International Development Finance Corporation, which would be our own sort of international development finance institution. And so if the United States can show that we can provide better financing that is for more diverse, socially inclusive and environmentally protecting growth-enhancing finance, then there'll be competition could be a good thing. We love to preach. Americans love to preach competition until it's competition with us.
With or without political attachment to the finance.
Well, we shall see.
Now, one good thing that is happening because of China investing in the region is that recently there was an initiative by the U.S. Treasury, and I believe they reached an agreement with Mexico, and then they reached an agreement with Panama in terms of for the development of the energy sector, both in Mexico and in Panama. So I think the U.S., some institutions are reacting to the fact that the Chinese are so engaged in Latin America that they are reacting, and besides looking at other sectors that are of interest for Latin America, besides security and immigration.
Great. We have a few minutes, and I know there's a lot of expertise in the House. I can't see you very well, but I can see a hand there. We have 2 microphones either side, so you're encouraged to go to the... Yeah, it's just there, I think. I think I can see that. If you could bring the House lights up, that helps a lot. Thank you.
Yes, oh, there we go.
So please... tell us who you are, and if your question's aimed at a particular panelist, tell us that too.
My name is Luis Parada. I am from El Salvador, but I'm an attorney here. I've lived here for 21 years. Question is about El Salvador, actually, since you mentioned that. And the surprise in El Salvador was not just the opening of relations with China, and of course, with that has to come along the severing of relations with Taiwan, but a surprise. I mean, there was no transparency at all. There was no discussion or anything. It was just an overnight surprise, immediately followed by the Prime Minister of Taiwan saying, yes, we were asked for all this investment and actually a political contribution to the ruling party, and we said no. So the implication is that China said yes. And the question I have is, and it has been said by the U.S. ambassador in El Salvador that China's practice is to actually not think twice about paying a bribe if it's asked. My question is, in the experience that you have had, the countries that have relations with China and the experts from other institutions, is it true that China would have a policy of actually bribing countries to establish relations with them?
Well, I can answer from Panama, and let me be very clear. China is the second largest user of the Panama Canal. 10% of the Panamanian population is from Chinese origin, and is the second largest supplier. So for Panama, it's strategic to have a relationship with China, even though we share probably more common values with Taiwan, and we have a very long relationship with Taiwan. We changed because it was in the interest of Panama to do so.
But again, who is the corrupt? The one asking for the bribe or the one paying the bribe? Both of them, certainly, but we cannot blame the actions of a company or a country to that country if the practice is accepted in the other country. So I cannot say Brazil is a corrupt country because Odebrecht was a corrupt company. It is that company, it is that group, and luckily, I was talking that with Tatiana. Luckily, there is a judiciary that has put those people in jail. But that's it's our own work. You know, if you're saying that the country has accepted a bribe to change its policy, we'll look at the political establishment, because that should not be there. I mean, the
question was the likelihood of this having happened. Does anyone? Yes.
I think that's an interesting question. I think the media will probably emphasize that. The Taiwanese, perhaps, talking to people in Central America that shifted from Taiwan to China, have argued that one of the sources of a lot of corruption was actually Taiwan, because there was a lot of unaccounted cash floating around to the ministries and to the people in the government, and that has been the evidence that at least the Costa Ricans have given me. I think there is a financial incentive, obviously, for El Salvador to switch to China because they will get more money for their cooperation. You want to call that bribing? I mean, it's a national interest for El Salvador. I think very respected in that sense because Taiwan doesn't have the funding to offer that China actually has.
Okay. The young man there was, yeah.
Yeah, Dr. Gallagher, my question is for you. So you mentioned
Could you tell us who you are, please?
Sebastian Mag from FTI Consulting.
Thank you.
You mentioned in your initial remarks that had China not stepped in after the 2008 financial crisis, we'd probably be seeing much more of Argentinas and Venezuelas in Latin America. But I don't think I need to remind you that Argentina and Venezuela borrowed the heaviest from China next to Brazil in the region. And one could argue, I want your opinion on this, one could argue that financing that Venezuela and Argentina received from China could have provided a cushion for their structurally high fiscal deficits. And we're seeing the consequences of that being dragged to today. So was it that China really stepped in to save the day, or did they just prolong the crisis a little bit and we're just about to see that happening now? There's a small spin-off question I'd like to ask Tatiana. Brazil also borrowed heavily from China, but the borrowing was slightly different in that it was decentralized. Petrobras borrowed directly from China instead of it going to the central government in Brasilia. Do you think this is a better method of borrowing from China, to just have it to state-owned companies that have their own corporate governance and that can manage the money themselves rather than to the central governments? Thanks both.
Great question. Well, the whole region went from no trade with China to making it their second largest trading partner for the whole region and number one for South America, and that some countries helped their fiscal space with that, and some of them squandered it, which is my point. Venezuela is an absolute case in point. You know, they didn't just squander their China opportunities. Theirs is more of a political crisis that the economy was a tool of it. They well, I'll let experts go deeper into that. So clearly the Chinese loans helped Venezuela, continue to help Venezuela kick the can down the road. Argentina is a little bit more complicated. I'll blame 50% of it on the past, 25% on the century bonds, and 25% on the Fed and the Trump tantrum and what's happening in markets right now with contagion. So that one's a little bit more complicated. I guess a good counterfactual, sort of Ecuador and China, I mean Ecuador and Venezuela and Argentina and Chile too, right? So you got Chile, which totally did well with the China boom, selling all that copper to them. They've got a stabilization fund that helped them have the largest stimulus package in the region. They spent a lot, invested in education, invested in poverty alleviation, and they've been able to grow significantly. Same thing with Ecuador. You know, they're fairly interesting. Ecuador's, if you go look for all, we have a database with the dialogue of all these projects that are funded by the Chinese, and the Associated Press did a story. They went looking for Ecuador, with all due respect, in Venezuela, with all due respect to the Venezuelans. They couldn't find half of them. Okay, I have issues with some of the projects that the Ecuadorians have financed, but they're all there. There are hydroelectric power plants all over the place. There's wind power plants. There's infrastructure and so forth. They're actually one of the only countries in the region since 2003 that averaged pretty close to 25% of GDP investment in the region, and so they used it. They're not in that place, and so I'll agree. Venezuela is the Pakistan of the region for this. And China, like I said earlier, has to get better on its due diligence with respect to debt sustainability. You know, they get in the same problem that the U.S. banks did. You know, Venezuela started going and saying, "Look, you're not going to get any of your money back if you give us another $10 billion." And when China had $4 trillion in reserves, that was not a problem. But this is a unique time for China right now because they're becoming more risk averse than they ever have. They prematurely opened up their capital account and lost over $1 trillion over the last 18 months. They're worried about their shadow banking system and the financial instability at home, and they're worried that they might have to do what they did in 1997 and sort of mop it up with their own reserves. And so the IMF says that even though they have trillions, still trillions of dollars worth of reserves, every Latin American country would die for that. The optimal rate is they're actually below it. In what it would take to pay for imports and pay for mopping up the region, and so they can't gamble with this money in Pakistan, Venezuela, all over the place anymore, and they need to get a lot more sharp about risk assessment.
Tatiana, a quick response.
Yes. I think the way that the Chinese financing has flowed to Brazil, has to do with specifics also of the country and the situation. So we actually have, in the last years, we have been a net creditor country, so we really don't have an external debt problem. So it's just normal that companies would borrow according to their situation. And when when the Petrobras needed that back in 2009, in a very volatile situation, the Chinese were there and they showed up, and it was actually this loan was already paid back recently, so I think it was good business for both sides.
I'm going to ask you to be brief, sir, because we're running out of time.
I'll be very brief.
Thank you.
Timothy Towell, former State Department officer, 30 years, mostly in Latin America in the last century. Is there any linkage between the Chinese investment trade in our hemisphere and the question of diplomatic relations? The Chinese have a fit about Taiwan, as everybody knows. I was just down at the inauguration of the new president of Paraguay, Mario Abdo Benitez, and the Chinese president was there, or the Taiwanese president was there, a very attractive lady. And according to the international press, the Chinese went bananas over that, and also about the fact that she came through the United States, coming and going, and came to Washington, went up on Capitol Hill, went to California, went to the Reagan Museum, saw congressmen, did all that stuff. Is there any relationship, or is it two different things?
Certainly. I mean, it's obvious, isn't it? When China opened relationships with Peru, Taiwan is believed in their own terms that it's part of China. So they don't accept another embassy. No country will accept the same name of his own country with another embassy. No, not even the Germans. You know, East Germany was called Deutsche Demokratische Republik, and the other one was the Bundesrepublik. So nobody could miss them, and that's what happens. I mean, it truly is. But looking beyond this difference between China's, I think the role that China is playing in Latin America is a long-term role. And because they think in long term, they have plans for 2050 with Latin America. So most countries are looking at the next 10 years. China is looking at the next half century, at least. So that's a very important issue to have in mind.
I tend to agree. The minister.
These are going to have to be your closing remarks.
Yeah, I tend to agree with the minister. China is the largest country in terms of population, the second largest economy, a huge trading partner with Latin America, has significant reserve, just strategic for the region to have a relationship with China, and it's a reality. So more than Taiwan, even though probably we share more values with Taiwan than with China. But the reality is that in the interest of Latin America to have good relationship with China, just as is in the interest of Latin America to have good relationship with the U.S.
Tatiana.
Quick comment on the Taiwan question, actually. To my recollection, because we are now talking about the recent situation of El Salvador, but what happened is during many years, actually, China was sort of trying not to let many countries, move to the Chinese side to avoid, difficult questions both with Taiwan, and because when the relations are warmer on that side, then they would avoid actually this. Or so I think it's not true that China goes around enticing those countries. Probably many would choose to do that. If I'm not talking specifically of any case, I'm just mentioning that this was so. So since it's my last comments, it's really a pleasure to be here today, and we are very hopeful that that dialogues like that will lead us to more coordination, will lead us to especially having more consistent national strategies to deal with China, and also to upgrade our regional strategy to deal with China, especially with a view to more infrastructure integration.
Kevin, is that what you would hope for the next, if we were to look at the next 10 years?
Sure, I would say that China is a tremendous, and Asia in general is a tremendous opportunity for the region, but every opportunity brings its own challenges. And the nut to crack is to maximize the benefits and mitigate the risks of those challenges, and conversations like this and bringing people together like the way you folks do and are part of that process.
Having a regional strategy is very challenging, very difficult. In foreign policy terms, it's almost impossible, but having cooperation, it is possible. And I think the majority of the countries in Latin America are realizing that it is for their benefit to have a good relationship with China. China wants to have a healthy relationship, and they also want countries that have a coherent idea of what they want in the future. And I think that should be one of the pushing elements on Latin America getting together to have a clear strategy with China. But still very difficult. Possible in academia, but in reality a little bit more difficult. Forums like CAF, the IDB, can push forward this agenda because they have the capacity to think long term, which countries, politically speaking, can't. So I think it is very important to emphasize to have a long-term strategy, perhaps learning from other initiatives like the Pacific Alliance that brings the private sector, which is forced to think about the long term more than the actual governments. And I think I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. This has been a very rich discussion. It would be a shame to try and summarize it in 30 seconds, but I think one of the key lessons that I've drawn from it is that the arrival of this big player is at least highlighting the need for a solution to some of Latin America's long-term problems. You know, Simón Bolívar said, you know, creating unity in Latin America is like plowing the sea. We've come quite a long way from there, but we still seem to be talking about a need for firmer institutions, for more coordination, for more cooperation, and for more strategic planning. And if the China challenge, or the challenge of China's arrival, helps to stimulate that, then that seems to me a very promising, positive note to end on in the future. So thank you so much, all of you. It's been terrific to be in conversation with you. Thank you for being here, and please thank our panelists.
Thank you, Isabel, and members of the panel for that fascinating discussion. And thanks to everyone for joining us for the first day of the 22nd Annual CAF Conference. We trust you enjoyed today's sessions, and we hope to see you back here tomorrow for a full day of a stimulating exchange. We have a great agenda on tap with another impressive lineup of distinguished speakers. Registration begins tomorrow morning at 8:15 with breakfast, and the first session will begin at 9. Thank you all once again. Have a wonderful evening, and we look forward to seeing you bright and early tomorrow morning. Thank you.